Chapter 334. Last night's snowstorm covered a wide area, from the north to Cold Shadow City, to the west to Wild Willow City, to the south to Black Raven City, including the Bite Man and Holy Crown City. Everything was covered in snow, but the cities of the Bite Man were protected by the Tree of Life, so they were the least affected. Outside of Fort Maxine, there was green vegetation everywhere. There were trees, bushes, grass, and vines. The city walls could no longer be seen, and even the sky above the city was covered in a giant net made of vines. In just a few days, this place had turned into a green forest. In the center of the city, there was a giant tree that was hundreds of meters tall. The layer upon layer of treetop was more than 1,000 meters in radius. It was majestic and magnificent, and its rugged trunk was extremely thick. 70 to 80 elves holding hands and forming a circle could barely hug the trunk. The vines that covered the sky stretched out from all directions of the city and gathered here, drilling into the depths of the earth along the bark of the tree. Although it was not the real tree of life, the power of the seed of life was not to be underestimated. In fact, the green vegetation that covered the entire city was evolved from a single seed. The inside of the city was much warmer than the outside world. The green vegetation not only covered the sky above Fort Maxine, but also covered the depths of the earth where the naked eye could not see. If a god were to descend upon the world and use his unparalleled strength to pull out the city and throw it into the stars, he would find that the seed of life was the center of all the vegetation. The green vegetation that extended out formed an irregular circle that tightly covered the entire city. In the depths of the vegetation, a large number of elves were hidden. They could not be seen from the outside, but if there was even the slightest movement, countless elves would come out of the green and launch a fierce attack. A silhouette appeared in the distance. He walked slowly across the snowy plains and gradually approached Fort Maxine. It was an elf, and from his appearance, he looked very young. He was riding on a brightly colored horse. That's right, it was an extremely ordinary horse. Pointy ears were the most prominent feature of elves. However, other than the pair of pointy ears, the other parts of the elf looked strange. Of course, the so-called strange was from the elf's point of view. He had a thick beard on his face, which was the most incredible thing. Elves also had beards, but they naturally liked to dress themselves up, so they always shaved their beards clean. Only elves who were over 1,000 years old and were gradually showing signs of aging would grow beards to distinguish themselves from young elves. That elf looked very young, with fair skin and firm muscles, without any signs of aging. His chest was wide open, revealing his muscular chest. He carried a frightening giant bough on his back. Every few dozen meters, he would pick up a shiny wineskin and take a big gulp. As he breathed, he exhaled a sour smell of alcohol. Obviously, he was riding an inferior horse and drinking inferior wine. His financial situation should be very bad. In the vast snowy plains, the figure was very clear. The elves in charge of guarding the fort had already noticed the intruder from afar. They took off their longbows and waited silently. The figure was getting closer and closer. An elf came out of the bushes and shot an arrow on the ground in front of the inferior horse. He shouted, "Stand there and don't move." Although the elves had good eyesight and could see the features of the intruder, the spies sent by the Holy Crown City had used some unknown method to disguise themselves as returning elves. After they were found out, they caused a lot of damage. Now, the elves were more and more vigilant. A mischievous smile appeared on the figure's face as he jumped off his horse and patted it lightly. "Old friend, don't move around. You've been warned." With that, he strode towards Fort Maxine. "I'm telling you, don't move." That elf roared. Behind that elf, hundreds of other elves jumped out. They all pulled their longbows and aimed at the intruder. However, only a small part of the elves reacted violently. Most of the elves just stood there in a daze. When they looked at each other, they could see the shock and disbelief in each other's eyes. They couldn't believe it. The figure didn't pay any attention to the hostile elves and continued to stride forward. The leader of the elves let out an angry roar and raised his hand to shoot arrows. Hundreds of arrows whistled through the air and flew toward the figure. A six-pointed star flashed on the figure's forehead. He first put the wine bag in his bosom, then reached out his hand and patted the cloud of arrows. With just a light pat, hundreds of arrows flew out in all directions with a boom, like a blooming cloud of smoke. Galbin, a stunned elf, finally couldn't help but scream. However, his screams didn't get any response from his companions. Most of the elves were still in a daze. The figure in front of them was too different from the one in their memories. Only his eyes and brows looked similar. Enemy attack. The leader of the elves took a few steps back and roared. At this moment, Great Elf Lydia was whispering to Blanche nearby. When she heard the chaos outside, she frowned and turned to walk towards the city wall. The chaos outside had turned into panic. Hundreds of elven archers were desperately attacking. But no matter how hard they tried, the figure only needed to stretch out his hand, and the arrows would turn into scrap metal. The figure's footsteps weren't affected at all, and he continued to approach Fort Maxine. The distance between them was less than 30 meters. Just as the leader of the elves was about to give the order to retreat into the depths of the forest, the figure suddenly stopped. Lydia stood in front of him, and the two looked at each other in silence. No matter if her opinions were suppressed or approved, and no matter how hard Prudence tried to make things difficult for her in the past, Lydia always gave off a very calm vibe. She would not be surprised by honor or disgrace, and she would not show her emotions on her face. However, at this moment, Lydia was completely different from before. Her chest was heaving up and down violently. Her hands, arms, and even her entire body were trembling uncontrollably. She even did something that only a little girl would do, biting her lips with her snow-white teeth. After a while, the figure slowly opened his arms and smiled. "Come, little cutie, let me hug you." Excitement, ecstasy, and excitement all turned into laughter after the figure spoke. Lydia couldn't help but roll her eyes at the figure, but she still obediently walked over and hugged the figure. The moment Lydia hugged the man, the stunned elves suddenly went crazy. They jumped, screamed, cried, and danced like a tidal wave as they rushed over to Lydia's side. Feeling the warmth of the figure's chest and the strong hug, Lydia's eyes slowly filled with tears. She said softly with a choked voice, "Galbin, welcome home." This time, it was the other elves' turn to be stunned. They weren't elves from Wild Willow City, so they couldn't understand why their companions were so excited. Divine Archer Galbin, the one who owned the Goth's Bow, the one who was the true commander of Wild Willow City, the one who was called the two killing machines of Wild Willow City together with Lydia, the one who had a conflict with the Senate, the one who ran away from home for more than 50 years, the one who disappeared without a trace, was finally back. Excitement spread like crazy, and cheers came from every corner of Fort Maxine. The elves from Wild Willow City cheered and rushed towards the direction of cheers. When Galbin was all-powerful, the lords of the later generation such as Grand Duke Solomon, Forza, Zagun, Dismark, and even Guevara were just children. Some of them weren't even born yet, and Wild Willow City was the most powerful city at that time. However, because of their different ideologies, Galbin and the Senate finally had a conflict. Moreover, blood was spilled. The Senate had a collective meeting and decided to execute Galbin. Although Great Elder Amjala stood his ground against the majority and even threatened to resign, he was unable to quell the anger of the Senate. In the end, both sides took a step back and decided to chase Galbin out of Wild Willow City. However, when the elves who passed the order went to find Galbin, Galbin had already left. After Galbin left, Wild Willow City became worse and worse. In the end, they could only rely on alliances with other cities to barely protect their territory. Lydia also resigned from all her military power and ran to isolated Cliff City to do business, becoming a merchant. Right often had to be proven by wrong. This was a sad and helpless principle. When Galbin had a conflict with the Senate, many elves thought that Galbin was too impulsive. He actually killed an elder of the Senate for a human woman. However, after Galbin left, the situation of Wild Willow City became worse and worse, and the elves began to miss Galbin again. especially after the war 20 years ago, when the Silver Pegasus Legion was almost completely annihilated. The nostalgia reached its peak. The elves believed that if Gao Bin was still here, they wouldn't have been defeated so miserably. Although under the leadership of the Senate, all the elven tribes on the continent had gathered together and achieved great results, many elves still felt uneasy and fearful. The elves of isolated Cliff City brought back a lot of information about Lord Raphael. He was a dragon slayer, had magical magic, and his comprehensive combat ability was unfathomable. At first, some elves didn't believe it, but later, facts proved that the elven mercenaries weren't lying. He went deep underground and eliminated Zagund in a short period of time. Then, he attacked the surface and occupied the Holy Crown City overnight. The elves attacked with all their strength, but still suffered a great loss under the Holy Crown City. Tens of thousands of elves were killed or injured, and countless were captured. This was enough to prove that Lord Raphael was much more powerful than the elves. In the past, if there were dragons to fight together, it would always bring great confidence to the elves. But now it was different. Lord Raphael was a dragon slayer who had killed several giant dragons. Could the dragons really be relied on? Gao Bin's return gave the elves a shot of adrenaline. If they only relied on prudence, they wouldn't be Lord Raphael's opponent. But with Gao Bin, they had absolute confidence. In the meeting room of Fort Maxine, 2 elves and a human were sitting on chairs and talking in low voices. The great elder of the United Senate, Abdullah, and the military commander of the elves, Prudence, sat on both sides. They actually gave the middle seat to the human. By doing this, can we really defeat that Raphael? Abdullah asked hesitantly. Abdullah, did I hear you right? Are you doubting the power of the dragon language magic? The human said lightly, his tone full of condescension. No. Abdullah smiled bitterly. The elven mercenaries won't lie about this. Raphael has an immortal body. I'm worried. Immortal body? The human said contemptuously. Do you think he is the god of the underworld, Hamas? That's just a puppet magic. Puppet magic? Yes, I've heard the elders talk about it, but the human hesitated. This magic has been lost for a long time. That Raphael has many secrets, so we must capture him alive. Capture him alive? The smile on Abdullah's face became even more bitter. It was already very difficult to kill Raphael, but they still wanted to capture him alive? Is this what the elders of the Dragon Clan want? Prudence asked. He was helpless against Abdullah's response. He didn't even know how to pretend to be polite. If he agreed first, then his life or death would be in his hands. This was not something the dragons could decide. If he accidentally made a mistake, everything would be solved. Yes, the human nodded. I understand, Prudence said softly. Prudence said in a low voice, but Raphael is very cunning. I've already set up an inescapable net and waited for him to come to Sunir, but he hasn't shown up yet. Are we going to wait forever? That's not the way to go. How to lure him out is your problem. My task is to wait for him to appear and seal his body. The human smiled. Prudence still wanted to say something, but suddenly he heard a loud shout from afar. At the same time, an elf elder rushed in and shouted, Great elder, bad news. Gao Bin is back. Gao Bin. Abdullah's face was filled with ecstasy. He jumped up and said, Are you crazy? What's wrong with this? It's great. Ha! But, Sunir, the smile on Abdullah's face suddenly stopped, and his face turned pale. Outside Fort Maxine, Gao Bin and Lydia looked at each other and smiled. Lydia whispered, It's been 50 years. What have you been busy with? Why don't you come back to see your old friends? Don't tell me you're worried about the Senate. I don't believe you care about them. I've been busy farming, Gao Bin said with a smile. Farming? An image appeared in Lydia's mind. It was Gao Bin wielding a hoe and sweating profusely under the sun. She couldn't help but laugh. It's not funny. I promised to be with her for the rest of her life. So, Gao Bin sighed. You've been with that human woman all this time? Lydia couldn't laugh anymore. Yes. What does it feel like to watch someone grow old and die slowly? Lydia reached out her hand and touched Gao Bin's beard. She sighed and said, You become so down and out. You're like a homeless man. It's hard to say. Galvin narrowed his eyes. In the beginning, I only felt hatred. Hatred, hatred for the insignificance of life. Hatred for the ruthlessness of time. Hatred for my own powerlessness. Galvin smiled. But in the end, I slowly accepted it. Other than the gods, all life has to bow before the laws, right? I will grow old one day, too. Ha! Although I can't bring back her youth, I can at least make her happy and satisfied every day. She's so lucky to have you by her side. Lydia sighed. Lucky? Galvin's eyes suddenly shone with a sharp light. When he first appeared, the first thing he did was to tease Lydia. Later, when he talked about the past, he gave off a feeling of vicissitudes of life. Now, he had turned into an incomparably sharp and fearless arrow. No one could tell which one was the real him. She's been beaten until she's crippled and blind. She can no longer see the blue sky and blooming flowers. Lucky. Galvin sneered. What I'm doing is just to make up for the harm we've done to her. She can't see your hatred, your sorrow, and helplessness. Isn't that lucky? And, compared to Hazel, she's lucky. Lydia said softly. Galvin, you've hurt her too deeply. Hazel, what happened to her? Galvin's expression changed slightly. He quickly asked. She's fallen and become a night elf. Night elf. Galvin breathed a sigh of relief. His expression was one of cynicism. I guess you're going to look for Hazel, right? Lydia said with a smile. How is that possible? Galvin shook his head. His expression became serious again. She's a night elf who betrayed the goddess of nature. If I see her, I'll definitely teach her a lesson. Forget it, Galvin. Do you think I don't know you? Lydia couldn't help but laugh. You even dared to kill an elder of the Senate. Do you really care about her identity and faith? I'm telling the truth. Galvin's expression was still very serious, but his eyes were full of laughter. I'm really helpless when it comes to you. Lydia shook her head. You use more than 50 years to make up for a human woman, and then you want to find Hazel to make up for the harm you've done to her. Could it be you've been constantly making up for your regrets and mistakes your entire life? I still want to make it up to you, if you're willing. Galvin smiled and reached out his hand to lift Lydia's chin. Then he said, let's not talk about this anymore. The Great Elder has come out, but whether he'll repeat the Senate's expulsion order or welcome me, it's hard to say. Impugila had already brought Prudence and a dozen elders over. Galvin finally regained his composure and knelt on one knee. Great Elder. Get up, my child. Impugila hurriedly reached out and helped Galvin up. Before Impugila could say anything, Galvin opened his mouth again. Obviously, he wasn't a passive person. No matter what situation he was in, he liked to take the lead. Where's Sunir? As soon as he said this, the expressions of Impugila and the others, including the elders, changed. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 335. The meeting hall was silent. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and the things that shouldn't be said were left unsaid. Great Elder Uptila and a dozen or so elders kept their eyes on Galvin. Galvin's face was gloomy as he sat there with his body tilted. Most of the elves cared about proper manners, especially the superior elves. Galvin was the only exception. He was used to doing things his own way. When the conflict wasn't that big, some elders who were more experienced warned Galvin that it was disrespectful to the Great Elder. However, Galvin just laughed and said that he had to keep his respect in his heart and that it had nothing to do with his posture. Some nosy elves passed these words to Uptila. Uptila was a little touched. He was touched because he understood Galvin's personality and he knew that Galvin really cared about him. He sighed because he was the one who brought up Galvin and Sunir. Why was there such a big difference between their personalities? Your Prudence? Galvin's gaze fell on Prudence. Yes. Prudence bowed. Among all the elves in the meeting hall, he was in the most awkward position. Galvin's tone and posture lacked basic etiquette, but he had to answer. Galvin was Sunir's brother. It was reasonable for him to respect Galvin, regardless of whether Galvin respected him or not. However, he couldn't show too much respect to Galbin because he was the commander of the allied army of elves. If he showed too much respect to Galbin, it would be detrimental to his own position. Galbin nodded. He was very satisfied with his first impression of Prudence. Prudence loved beauty and hated ugliness. This was the characteristic of most intelligent beings, and Galbin was no exception. What I don't understand is, Galbin said faintly, why did Sunir enter the illusion of the temple at this time? Upgula and the elders looked at each other, not knowing how to answer. From the moment they entered the meeting hall until now, none of the elves had lied. They were all telling the truth, but they were always vague about the key points. No one wanted to lie to Galbin because they couldn't bear the disastrous consequences. Because Sunir doesn't want to marry Prudence, Lydia suddenly said faintly. Oh, Galbin smiled and glanced at Prudence again. His second impression of him was still very satisfactory. Prudence was able to remain calm even when he heard things that were not beneficial to him. His brother-in-law was not a superficial person. So, Sunir has her own favorite elf. Who is it? Like brother, like sister, Lydia said softly. What do you mean? Galbin frowned and said in distress. Lydia, don't play games with me, okay? After being idle for so many years, my brain can't keep up anymore. Just tell me directly. I've made myself very clear. Like brother, like sister. Galbin's face suddenly changed, and he jumped up from his chair. She likes Hazel. It can't be. Prudence was dumbfounded. The name Hazel was obviously a female elf, and the elders almost collapsed on the spot. Even Abdura didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Gosh! Lydia put her hand on her forehead. It seems that you've become stupid after farming for so long. Then what do you mean? Galbin looked at Lydia from head to toe. Could it be? Lydia was speechless. She was afraid that Galbin's strange divergent mind would have some absurd ideas, so she hurriedly said, Sunir likes a human called Raphael. That's good, that's good. Galbin breathed a sigh of relief. Why didn't you tell me earlier? You didn't have to scare me. Raphael? I think I've heard this name before. I just heard it. Lydia said, he's the current lord of the Holy Crown City. Oh. Galbin held his chin with his hand and leaned there, thinking. His face became very dignified and very serious. After a while, he slowly shook his head and said, This is not good. As a descendant of the gods, she can't shirk her responsibility. Even Lydia couldn't help but laugh. She rolled her eyes at Galbin and said, You're talking about yourself, aren't you? Because I've experienced the feeling of watching people grow old and die slowly. So I don't agree. Galbin's voice became low and powerful. Sunir can't bear it. The elves in the room all showed a happy face. Even Abdura breathed a sigh of relief. His heart that had been in his throat finally calmed down. Lydia smiled and then closed her mouth. She was an elf. Although she didn't agree with joining the Senate to start this large-scale war, she wouldn't stop the marriage between Prudence and Sunir, at least not publicly. Lydia, you should have persuaded Sunir, right? Galbin asked slowly. Yes. What did she say? When you left, Sunir was still very young, so you don't know. She's as stubborn as you are. Lydia sighed. Really? Galbin looked at Lydia with interest. Sure enough, Lydia was right. He didn't care about traditions at all. I tried to persuade her once, but she could persuade me 10 times. Lydia couldn't help but smile as she recalled the scene at that time. What did she persuade you to do? Galbin was even more interested. She told me not to interfere with her freedom. She said I couldn't understand her. She said a lot. Lydia paused. In the end, she also warned me that if I forced her to leave Raphael and marry a strange elf or someone else, she would rather die. And Pugilia's heart skipped a beat. Prudence was furious and glared at Lydia coldly. An elven elder couldn't help but yell. Lydia, watch where you stand. Shut your mouth. Abdura yelled, but he wasn't yelling at Lydia. He was yelling at the elder who yelled. There were 2 great killing machines in Wild Willow City. One was divine archer Galbin, and the other was magic archer Lydia. In the ancient elven language, God had many meanings. God's power, God's domain, Godhead, and so on. On the other hand, demon only had two meanings. One was the power of the devil, and the other was an adjective that referred to something crazy, terrifying, and had supreme power. That was why magic was called magic, and devils were also called devils. Magic archer Lydia was an extremely rare elven archer who had mastered magic. It wasn't the elves' life magic, but fire, lightning, earth, and other natural magic. On the other hand, Lydia was also an extremely crazy warrior. Extremely crazy. Although Lydia had been standing there quietly for decades, Abdurrah would never forget Lydia's nature. Just like the day when Galbin left Wild Willow City, Lydia had just resigned from her military post and then barged into an elven elder's house. However, the elder who was severely injured by Galbin was already dead. In front of dozens of elders, Lydia laughed and said, "This guy died at the right time." The elders were shocked. Lydia's intention was clear. She wasn't going to visit the injured. She was going to kill someone. Galbin, who was in a fit of rage, still retained a bit of his sanity and didn't kill Lydia. However, Lydia, who still retained her sanity, dared to break into the home of an elven grand elder and kill him in broad daylight. This was enough to prove that Lydia was a complete lunatic. These idiots, Abdurrah cursed in his mind. Lydia had been meekly accepting everything for decades and had forgotten Lydia's nature. It was as if one had forgotten the pain after the wound had healed. Compared to the two elves, Galbin was a lazy tiger basking in the sun. If he was angered, he would go on a rampage and hurt people. On the other hand, Lydia was a harmless little white rabbit who kept a low profile. However, if she felt threatened, she would only respond with one word: destruction. If she didn't destroy the enemy, she would destroy herself. However, no matter how terrifying Lydia's nature was, Abdurrah wasn't worried because he had seen through her. Lydia had no backbone. To put it bluntly, she didn't dare to take responsibility. He knew that Lydia had always been against joining forces with the elders to start this large-scale war. However, what did Lydia do? She only asked some elders to probe and discuss a possible way to save the elves. From the beginning to the end, Lydia had been highly cooperative with the military operations and tried her best to complete her mission. Lydia didn't dare to take on the responsibility of deciding the fate of the elves. She didn't dare. Otherwise, with Lydia's nature, she would have put her thoughts into action a long time ago. However, with Galbin's return, everything had changed. Galbin's personality was very strange, and he would never be controlled by any power. His mind and thoughts were even stranger. Sometimes they seemed absurd, and sometimes they would make people slap the table in praise. If Galbin dared to think, Lydia dared to do it. Galbin was Lydia's backbone, and Lydia was Galbin's sharp blade. Abdurrah also knew that Lydia had always been deeply in love with Galbin. However, because of her disfigured appearance, she was ashamed of her inferiority, so she buried her love in the bottom of her heart. Galbin treated Lydia as a good friend who could talk about anything, and Lydia also treated Galbin as a good friend. The only difference was that one was natural, while the other was deliberate. Abdurrah had quietly observed these two elves for 70 to 80 years. He knew too well that what Lydia buried deep in her heart was an unforgettable love. It was a love that was heavier than the mountains and deeper than the earth. It was a love that she would never regret, even if she had to die 100 times. Abdurrah had no doubt that if Galbin suddenly told Lydia that only by killing Prudence could he take back the command of the army, Lydia would immediately turn around and look for Prudence. It didn't matter if it was an assassination or an open challenge. She would either kill Prudence or be killed herself. "I see." Galbin suddenly laughed. However, his tone became gloomy. "So you two worked together to scheme against Sunir." Lydia regained her silence and sat there quietly. No matter what, she would not lie to Galbin. Her responsibility was to tell the truth and let Galbin make the decision. Ampugula was shocked. The elders around him all glared at Lydia angrily. Even Prudence did the same. This was a blatant display of hostility. Galbin was smart enough to notice that something was amiss. They didn't lie from the beginning because they were worried that they couldn't deceive Gao Bin, so they left some room to salvage the situation. Gao Bin, you can't say that. Abdurrah smiled bitterly. Elves are not meant to be with humans. You just said it yourself. It doesn't feel good. Do you have the heart to watch Sunir get tortured? Besides, Sunir is still too young. It's her first time falling in love with someone of the opposite sex. It's normal for her to have some feelings. You are her brother. You should come with us to persuade her. Yes, Gao Bin, another elder agreed. Sunir is young and immature. Are you immature as well? Now is the best time for us to restore the glory of the Elven Empire. You know what the wedding of two descendants of gods means to the elves. For the Elven Empire, for the elves, she should give up her irrational and immature feelings. Isn't that right? The Empire, elves. Gao Bin looked up at the sky and tapped his finger on the table. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment, he smiled and said, "These two things will always be the most powerful divine weapons that the minority can use to force the majority to sacrifice themselves. The more they like to talk about these two things, the safer they are, and the less likely they are to sacrifice themselves." Gao Bin, the elder, was so angry that he was tongue-tied. He could not believe that Gao Bin dared to blaspheme the goddess of nature and the entire elven race. Are you surprised? It seems that my evaluation is a bit too high. Then, I'll tell you the truth. Gao Bin calmly looked at the elven elder and said, "Do you remember someone saying that he would be willing to make any sacrifice for the empire, for some race? This kind of precious spirit is nothing but a pile of trash that can be ignited by any ambitious person to illuminate his name." The meeting hall fell into a deathly silence. Even Upula's eyes were wide open. Although Gao Bin's first words were blasphemous, he could barely pretend that he didn't hear them. However, the second half of his words were too blatant. This was no longer blasphemy, but vicious subversion. Subversion of traditions, subversion of beliefs, and the spirit and blood of countless elves that had been sacrificed for thousands of years. "Lydia, have you heard of this saying before?" "Who said that?" Gao Bin asked, pretending to be serious. Lydia tried hard to hold back her laughter. "You said it." "Me? It can't be." Gao Bin turned pale with fright. "When did I become so wise?" Lydia was tongue-tied. In the end, she could only roll her eyes at Gao Bin. After living for more than 200 years, Lydia had a lot of experience. She had experienced countless hardships and dangers. Her face was ruined. For an elf who loved beauty, what could be more painful than this? In the entire continent, the only person who could make her speechless and not know whether to laugh or cry was Gao Bin. "Gao Bin, are you crazy?" Upula said word by word. "I'm not crazy. I've been farming for more than 50 years. I'm more clear-headed than ever." Gao Bin said with a smile, "Those who always talk about the Empire and the Elven race are the ones who are crazy. They are calling the elves to rather love the soil of the grave than cherish their lively bodies. Gao Bin, I've been too indulgent with you in the past. That's why you become like this." Upula said bitterly, No, Ha. If your wish is right, then there's no such thing as justice and truth in this world." Gao Bin was still smiling. "You see, of course we're righteous. The orcs are fighting for their empire. They're righteous, so are the humans. Dragon City is righteous, Dragon Realm is righteous, and even the abyssal races are righteous. But there has to be someone who's wrong, right?" Upula's body trembled. He was so angry that he couldn't say a word. "Don't forget, you're an elf." An elven elder said with gritted teeth. "Yes, I'm an elf." Gao Bin's voice became lower and lower. He then smiled. "All right, I'll persuade Sunir, but I have a request." What? Upula couldn't believe his ears. He was extremely disappointed, but in the blink of an eye, he was extremely surprised. The contrast was too strong. Prudence felt that something was wrong. Ever since Gao Bin began to speak, he had grasped the emotions of all the elves. His every word was like an invisible baton. If he wanted them to laugh, they would laugh. If he wanted them to be sad, they would be sad. If he wanted them to be angry, they would be angry. But he had to admit that he was relieved when Gao Bin suddenly changed his stance. "What request?" Prudence asked. You, and you, including the elders of the Senate, attack the holy crown city tomorrow. Don't look at me, just do it yourselves. Then you don't have to come back. Galbin said solemnly. The soil of the grave is so fragrant and so desirable. I'll fulfill your wish. Sacrifice yourselves. You're being unreasonable. An elven elder screamed when he realized that he had been played again. Speak properly, don't yell. Can you be reasonable? Galbin looked very wronged. The situation is like this. Sunir doesn't want to sacrifice herself for us, so I need you to set an example. I also have a reason to persuade her. For the rise of the Elven Empire, you can even give up your lives. Of course, she will give up her feelings. It seems that you all don't want to. In the end, Galbin asked seriously. No one answered. All the elves were trembling. Uptula saw stars in front of his eyes. If it weren't for his identity, he would have spat out a few mouthfuls of blood. That would make him feel better. For the rise of the Elven Empire, you really don't want to? I'm so disappointed. I'm so disappointed. This time, it was Galbin's turn to be heartbroken. Sunir is right to sacrifice herself, but you can't sacrifice yourselves. Can anyone tell me why? On what basis? I didn't understand before. Those who shouted the slogan of sacrifice the loudest were always able to live comfortably. Now I understand. What you need is always the sacrifice of others. Galbin, for the elves of Wild Willow City, you are a legendary hero. I hope you can be reasonable and stop fooling around like a child. Prudence said coldly. That's right. Galbin pointed at Prudence. He was determined to be a hooligan until the end. Prudence's interruption not only didn't help the situation, but also brought the fire of war onto himself. Since you all don't want to, I'll change my condition. Kid, don't you want to marry my sister? Fine, but I don't think a guy like you is suitable to lead an army. Calling you trash. Although it's a bit excessive, it's close enough. How about this? You take my sister back to Wild Willow City and leave everything else to me. Don't worry, I'll do better than you. Bastard. Prudence roared and jumped up. He was a peak 12th rank powerhouse, the pride and hope of the elves. In his life, when had he ever been insulted so viciously? Prudence didn't just want to vomit blood. He was about to go crazy from anger. At the same time, Uptula stood up and grabbed Prudence's arm. Let's go. Let go. Chapter 336. It's so cold. Yelena rubbed her hands hard. The weather was getting colder and colder. It wasn't good to use magic to fight against nature. The magic shield could block the cold, but it was fixed and two people couldn't stand on the plane all the time. The magic shield could move with the person who was blessed, but it required a lot of magic power to maintain it. Furthermore, the range of the magic shield was very small, so it couldn't insulate the temperature. However, Yelena was very tenacious and only complained occasionally. Considering her identity and experience, it was not easy for her to do this. Master, this is Nuremberg, right? Harley shouted from the top of the mountain. Yelena hurriedly jumped off the unicorn, patted its back, and whispered, "Lie down and don't move." After saying that, she turned around and tiptoed towards the top of the mountain. The unicorn seemed to be very alert and obediently laid down in the snow. This should be it, Harley observed and said to himself. Isn't Nuremberg the only city nearby? When she was about to reach the top of the mountain, Yelena ignored the cold and crawled on the snow. She poked her head out little by little and looked down. Yelena, what are you doing? Hanjin came from behind and saw Yelena, who always paid attention to her manners, crawling forward in the snow. He felt it was very funny. Shoo! Yelena waved her small hands. Lie down, or they'll find us. Hanjin paused and smiled. It's okay. It's their misfortune to find us. Oh. Looking at Hanjin's undisguised sharp eyes, Yelena stood up awkwardly. She understood what Hanjin meant. Between an eagle and a rat, it was always the latter that needed to hide. Hanjin looked down at Nuremberg from above. When they first occupied Nuremberg, the local cavemen were always looking for trouble. After several failed attempts to negotiate with them, Ronning dug up the city wall and flooded the mountain. As a result, Nuremberg was almost in ruins. Although they had recruited vagabonds from all over the world, the reconstruction work had been slow. The outside forces also didn't allow them to rest and recuperate. First, Woodrow led his defeated army into Black Raven City, and then Biteman sent its allied forces to lurk in the dark. Han Jin remembered that the last time he saw Nuremberg, the total population of the city was only a few thousand. Even the city wall wasn't repaired. The army went all out to attack the Biteman, leaving almost no garrison behind because the city was worthless. But now Nuremberg had changed a lot. Looking from afar, one could clearly see a giant tree in the center of the city. It should be the Tree of Life. A large net made of countless vines covered the whole city. The city was surrounded by emerald green vegetation, isolating the city from the snow. Yelena, the cold doesn't affect dragons, right? Han Jin suddenly asked. Dragons aren't afraid of the cold. Yelena shook her head. When I met the orc warriors that day, there were many elves, but the elves had already retreated. Han Jin pondered. So, if the elves spread the news, the dragons could appear at any time? Impossible, Yelena said. Although dragons aren't afraid of the cold, they don't like to come out in winter, except for the frost dragons of the water element. It's not a matter of whether they like it or not. If there's an enemy here, why would they hide in their nest and sleep? Dragons are top-grade creatures. They look down on humans and elves. Sometimes they're willing to help the elves just because they find them pleasing to the eye, Yelena said softly. When it came to this, Han Jin couldn't catch up with her. Pleasing to the eye? Han Jin felt that this reason was ridiculous. This was war, not a game. Putting themselves in danger just because they found them pleasing to the eye? Do you know what dragons think of themselves? Yelena laughed. No, they think they're the noblest creatures, the kings of the whole continent. Yelena paused. They're born nobles. In this regard, dragons and elves are somewhat similar. When a few elves get together, they always talk about the past, you know? They don't think about the present or the future. They only like to remember the glory of the Elven Empire and talk about how beautiful that era was. The problem is that the Elven Empire has been eliminated by history. This is enough to prove that they have many flaws, and these flaws can't be made up for by beauty. A race that only knows how to remember the past has no hope at all. It's too pitiful, too sad. It's like a person who lives forever in a dream. When he wakes up, everything will be broken. Is this what you think? Han Jin was a little moved. Yelena was a little embarrassed. I heard it from my father. What else did he say? When the Elven Empire was at its peak, the elves were indeed the rulers of the entire continent. No matter where they went, they would be respected by all races. Even today, some elves still regard themselves as the masters of the world. They still maintain a high and mighty spirit and attitude. The dragon race likes this style. The Elven Empire has been destroyed for a long time, right? Do they still remember it? Han Jin asked. You ignored the lifespan of the elves. Some elves can even live for thousands of years. The Elven Empire was only a few generations away from them. To them, it's not that far away. Yelena said, if it were a human, they would have forgotten it long ago. Han Jin nodded slowly. He understood. The dragons are similar to the elves. Although their civilization is much longer than that of humans, compared to the current humans, they are very superficial. Superficial? That's not appropriate. Han Jin said softly, if you say that all humans united are stronger than the dragons and elves, I believe you. Superficial. In the eyes of many, the dragons are very mysterious and have the power to destroy the world. You think so too, don't you? Yelena's smile was quite proud. In fact, if all the dragons in the Dragon City and the Dragon City are added together, there are only 1,000 or 2,000 of them. This is enough to determine their superficiality and even their fate. Numbers don't mean anything. Han Jin was a little regretful. Although he was against Yelena's point of view, he also knew that Solomon must have his own reasons for saying so. If he had discussed it with Grand Duke Solomon face to face, he would have benefited a lot. Talking to Yelena, after all, was separated by a layer, and he couldn't speak freely. Huh, I said the same thing at that time. Yelena laughed. Yes, numbers don't mean anything. A dragon can destroy a village in an instant and kill thousands of people. But my father asked me, how can life grow quickly? This. Hanjin was stumped. Grand Duke Solomon's question was very difficult to answer. If he answered it seriously, he might not be able to finish it even after a few days and nights. Numbers don't mean anything. A long lifespan also doesn't mean anything. Yelena said, if a person is locked up alone in prison as soon as he is born, and if he can live for tens of thousands of years, will he become very smart and very powerful in the end? No. The dragon elders who manage Dragon City and Dragon Realm are only equivalent to the mayor of a human town. The lives they come into contact with are limited, and they are extremely familiar with each other. The place where they live is a forbidden area on the continent, and no one dares to break in. Life is simple and plain. In those long years, if there is no feeling, no shock, no confusion, and no threat, how can one grow? Yelena said, the footprints of humans can be found in every corner of the continent. Some people will come into contact with thousands or even tens of thousands of companions in their lives and become familiar with them. Every encounter is a new exploration and new thinking. First of all, one must grasp the nature of the stranger to determine whether the two parties will become friends or whether there is a possibility of mutual benefit. Also, what position should one place the other party in and whether one should maintain vigilance. Human nature is too complicated. Hanjin listened quietly and didn't interrupt Yelena. My father said that humans can live happily and simply, but many people choose complexity and sigh, Yelena said softly. Although the lifespan of humans is only a few decades, it doesn't matter. As long as we can live a wonderful life, it's enough. Grand Duke Solomon's words are thought-provoking, but we seem to have digressed. Hanjin smiled and said, what I want to know is whether the dragons will come to this place. I don't think so. Yelena felt embarrassed again. When Grand Duke Solomon talked to her about this, his central idea was that only constant exploration and thinking could make life mature and even lead the whole civilization to mature. If the dragons stayed in their nest all day and didn't go out, they would be useless no matter how long they lived. At least they wouldn't be able to promote the evolution of the whole race, and humans would have an incomparably brilliant future. It was because of these words that she suddenly brought her students to the world of Warcraft Forest to gain experience and got to know Hanjin. Otherwise, she would still be in the royal laboratory in the capital of elements. Why? No matter how pretentious the dragons are, they are very greedy by nature. They like gold, jewelry, magic crystals, and other precious things. The elves must have paid a high price for more than 20 dragons to join the war, Yelena said. Yelena said, dragons don't like to come out in the winter. If the elves really need the help of the dragons, they will have to pay a higher price to convince the dragons. If they can't satisfy the dragons, they won't care about their lives. That makes sense. Hanjin turned his eyes to Nuremberg. As a dragon slayer, are you still worried about those dragons? Yelena laughed. Hanjin smiled and didn't explain anything. Yelena, on the other hand, suddenly realized what he meant and blushed. Of course, Hanjin wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about her. The elves already know who attacked the orc warriors, so they should have some reaction. Hanjin whispered, we have been walking for 2 days, but we haven't seen a single elf. I feel a little strange. Then what should we do? Yelena was a little nervous, but she wasn't worried about the elves' attack. Raphael, are you thinking of going back? Of course not. Hanjin shook his head and turned to walk down the mountain. Yelena followed closely behind Hanjin. After clearing the snow, Hanjin sat down with his legs crossed and his hands quickly formed a spell. Yelena had seen this many times, so she subconsciously released a magic shield to cover herself and Hanjin. Her eyes sometimes observed Hanjin and sometimes looked around. After more than an hour, Hanjin was still releasing his vital energy, and small beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Hanjin didn't slow down until the sunset gradually approached the sky. A silver cyclone was spinning in front of him. Looking closely, There were countless runes as thin as spider, silk flashing and pressing against each other, like a mirror. Yelena, come here, Hanjin said in a low voice. Okay. Yelena squatted down and looked directly at Hanjin. Hanjin stretched out his hand and guided the cyclone. The cyclone wrapped around Hanjin's hand like flowing water. Then, Hanjin slapped the air toward Yelena. The countless runes suddenly turned into dazzling cold lights and rushed toward Yelena. Almost at the same time, the runes penetrated Yelena's skin and turned her face silver. Yelena only felt that the skin on her face became dry and heavy, but she was very obedient. Although she was also concerned about her appearance, she didn't yell for a mirror. She just looked at Hanjin silently. Okay. Hanjin let out a sigh of relief. If there is any danger, I will take you to a strange place. Don't talk or struggle. I will pull you, and you just need to follow me. When he said these words, Hanjin's expression was very solemn. Danger? Yelena blinked and recalled what Hanjin would do if there was danger. Immediately, she was shocked. You mean? Yelena pointed to the ground with her trembling finger. Yes. Hanjin nodded. With his current vital energy, the consumption of earthmeld was almost negligible. However, if he wanted to take someone with him, the consumption of vital energy would increase by hundreds or thousands of times, and the consumption of his divine mind would be even more intense. If he used faked earth corpse on Yelena, the consumption would be reduced, but it wouldn't have much effect. If the elves really attacked them with a few giant dragons, as long as they could kill Yelena once, they could kill her a second time. Not to mention Yelena. Even if Hanjin flew on his sword, he wouldn't be able to match the speed of the giant dragons. Yelena was very happy. She looked at Hanjin with a smile and didn't say anything. Hanjin closed his eyes again and adjusted his breath. As for whether the elves had discovered them, he didn't care at all. With his remaining vital energy, he could still kill a giant dragon in its peak state, not to mention the elves. Of course, if something happened, this fearless attitude could be equated with carelessness, but this was a common problem for all high-level masters. It was hard to imagine that masters like Jedis and Guevara would be so fearful even when they walked. They would run away at the slightest sign of trouble. It was difficult for these kinds of people to achieve anything. No matter how sharp a tiger's claws and teeth were, if it had the heart of a rabbit, it would never be able to become a leader. When the sky was slightly dark, Hanjin slowly opened his eyes and saw Yelena staring at him. Yelena hurriedly looked away, lowered her head, and said softly, "Has your magic power recovered?" With Yelena's situation and immaturity, every bit of kindness that Hanjin had shown her was magnified countless times in her heart. It had been a long time, but she was still touched. Almost. Hanjin nodded and then stood up. Let's go. Let's go inside Nuremberg and have a look. Inside? Yes. Are we going in just like that? Do you want to sneak in? Hanjin laughed. Okay. Yelena bit her lip. By the way, Raphael, I want to ask you something. What is it? Promise me first that you won't be angry. I won't be angry. Go ahead. Hanjin felt like he was coaxing a child. Morrisons, Sisu, and the others can barely be considered high-level professionals. The gap between you is getting wider and wider. There are many things that they can't help you with. Why do you always treat them so well? Just because you were friends? Hanjin was stunned. After a moment of silence, he slowly replied, How should I put it? Feelings are unreasonable. I only know that when I was a good-for-nothing, they could have ignored me, but they didn't. No matter how bitter or sweet the days were, they always took me with them. Yelena stammered and wanted to say something, but she closed her mouth again. Not satisfied? You want to ask about Sunir, don't you? Hanjin smiled. At that time, I had a misunderstanding with Sunir and was seriously injured by her. What? Yelena's eyes widened. Haha, it's true. Hanjin's eyes were very complicated. She knew my secret, and then she found Morrison's and asked Morrison's to go hunting with her. They were going to hunt an 8th-grade earth bear. At that time, Morrison's was still a swordsman, and Sasu was just a magician. Do you know what it means for them to challenge the earth bear? Death. I will never forget the scene when Morrison's and Sunir quarreled. Morrison said that Sunir was crazy, and he wouldn't be crazy with her. Sunir told him that grinding the bones of the earth bear into powder could heal my injuries. This was a secret recipe of the elves. Morrison's was a big fool. He actually believed it, and then they quietly left the camp. They went to hunt the earth bear. Did they succeed? Yelena asked nervously. No, they came back empty-handed. Fortunately, they recovered their senses in time. With Morrison's strength at that time, no, they escaped. Sunir was almost killed by the earth bear. Yelena paused. She hesitated for a long time, then finally gathered her courage and said hesitantly, You said Sunir knew your secret? That's secret. Can you tell me the secret? It's getting late. I think we should find a place to rest in Nuremberg, Han Jean said softly. In fact, he could make up a lie to avoid hurting Yelena's feelings, but he had no other choice. If he didn't find a chance to reject her now, it would be more and more difficult in the future. Yelena's face suddenly turned pale. Even if Han Jean said we'll talk later, it would have made her feel better. His indifference was like a sharp dagger, deeply piercing her heart. Chapter 337. The sky was already dark. The emerald-green vegetation that was full of vitality during the day gradually dimmed with the disappearance of the sun. It was like a swaying ghost shadow. When the wind blew, the branches and grass kept swaying, making rustling sounds. The atmosphere became a little strange. Yelena, cheer up, Han Jean had to remind her in a low voice. Yelena bit her lips, glanced at Han Jin's back, and then took out her magic wand from the space ring. Han Jean walked into the depths of the vegetation. Although Nuremberg seemed to be defenseless at the moment, Han Jean knew very well that there were about 100 elves hiding nearby. However, they were not in a hurry to show themselves. Instead, they crept backward slowly, trying to cut off Han Jin's escape route. Yelena rode on the unicorn's back with no expression on her face. The unicorn below seemed to be in a panic, and every few steps it took, it let out a low cry. The air in the city was much warmer than outside. The spacious roads were covered with dense grass, and some places where grass could not grow were covered with moist moss. The elves' ability to transform the environment was indeed very strong. In a few years, the city would disappear without a trace under the erosion of vegetation. The biggest difference between this city and a human city was that there were no lights here. Perhaps the elves were afraid of causing a fire and damaging the Tree of Life, so they simply did not allow lighting. However, such a large city was immersed in endless darkness, as if it was a ghost town. There were only a few lights in the distance, and the light source was very stable. They should be magic lamps. Han Jean suddenly stopped. More than a dozen elves jumped out from the trees on both sides and blocked his way. Behind them, 70 or 80 elves formed a battle formation, surrounding Han Jean and Yelena. You got guts. The elf in front, who seemed to be the leader, laughed. How dare you walk in with only 2 people? Ha ha. Forget it. I won't make it difficult for you. Put down your weapons, and I can guarantee your safety. I remember there should be a lot of people in the city. Where are they? Did you kill them all? Han Jean asked softly. As long as you don't mess with me, we won't kill people for no reason. The leader of the elves laughed and said, You should worry about yourself. I'll repeat myself, put down your weapon. You're not true warriors. Han Jean looked around. Although every elf was a qualified archer, there was still a difference between the elite and the ordinary in a regular army. Most of the elves in front of him and behind him were of average strength, but the elf leader was wearing a treasure hunter badge. What was more interesting was that the badge was issued by the Mercenary Association of Isolated Cliff City. Treasure hunters and swordsmen were of the same rank. The elf leader's strength was about the same as Morrison's, and he was Morrison's from 3 years ago. Are you provoking me? Be careful. There are over 100 arrows pointed at you. The elf leader was a little angry. Han Jean smiled. I want to know, where did you lock up the people in the city? As soon as Han Jean finished speaking, Yelena, who was behind him, suddenly raised her magic wand and chanted a spell loudly. The elves' expressions changed greatly, and Han Jean was also stunned. The dark world suddenly lit up. Through the dense vines, they could clearly see that the sky was as bright as day, and countless bolts of lightning were crazily surging. Among all the professions, magicians were the most vulnerable. For magicians, protecting themselves was far more important than killing their opponents. Yelena, however, was casting spells without any protection. Even if she was a super-grade professional, she would not be able to survive in this situation. Over 100 elves shot their arrows almost at the same time, and all of them were aimed at Yelena. Yelena smiled, and 2 drops of tears quietly overflowed from her eyes. Then, she waved her magic wand downwards, and huge pillars of lightning rained down. 9-grid thundercall. Hanjin's hair stood on end. He cast the ground shrink spell as fast as he could and appeared beside Yelena. Then, he pounced on Yelena like lightning, and at the same time, he opened his arms and hugged Yelena tightly in his arms. His body did not stop, and he continued to rush forward towards the tree wall. Because he was afraid that Yelena would be injured, Hanjin hugged her very tightly, as if they had become one person. Fortunately, Hanjin had mastered the ground shrink spell, and also, as usual, he had already blessed himself with the spirit possession spell. Otherwise, if he had been a little slower, Yelena would have been shot into a hedgehog by the elves. Hanjin could feel that a few arrows had hit his body, but they could not penetrate his dragon scale armor. There was also an arrow that flew past his nape, and he could even feel the coldness of the arrow. Pillars of lightning fell on the ground one after another, and the huge curtain of vegetation that covered the entire Nuremberg was torn apart. Broken branches and leaves were flying all over the sky, and sand and stones were flying everywhere. At the same time, the bodies of the elves were also torn apart. The elves who were responsible for blocking the escape route were in a battle formation, and the 9-grid Thundercall's attack range was very wide, so they became living targets. After a while, the lightning finally stopped, and over 100 elves fell into a pool of blood in all kinds of strange postures. Hanjin was right. They were not real warriors, and in the face of high-level magic, they were extremely fragile. None of them could escape this disaster. Yelena, are you crazy? Hanjin roared. At this moment, Hanjin had put Yelena down. They were both standing on a small hill. In fact, there should have been a house under their feet, but it was covered with grass and moss, so they could no longer see its original appearance. Yelena did not look at Hanjin. She struggled desperately and tried to poke her head out from Hanjin's shoulder. She waved her magic wand, and a ball of lightning shot out, chasing after the elves who were running away. It could only be said that Hanjin did not understand a woman's heart. At least, he did not understand the heart of Yelena's first love. Yelena was of noble birth, beautiful, and talented. It was not an exaggeration to say that she was the pride of the heavens. Whether at home or in the academy, whether she liked to keep a low profile or to show off, she would inevitably become the target of countless people's attention. Since she was young, when had she ever wronged herself like this? In order to get close to Hanjin, in order to get the warmth that she longed for, she did not hesitate to take care of Hanjin like a maid. What else could she do? Moreover, this was Yelena's first love. For all the boys and girls who had just fallen in love, love was the most sacred feeling in the world. It was their everything. To live for love and to die for love. This was ridiculous in the eyes of adults. After experiencing the hardships of life, they knew that there were other things that were just as important as love. However, the boys and girls only saw one thing. They dared to promise, to give, and even to sacrifice. All her grievances were in exchange for indifference. Yelena was really hurt. She was disheartened. She felt that fate was always playing tricks on her. However, although she was powerless against fate, she had an undeniable power, and she refused to face it directly. Even if fate was omnipresent and omnipotent, it could not play tricks on another kind of person. When Yelena raised her magic wand again, Hanjin grabbed her wrist. Yelena, can you calm down? I think we should have a good talk. Yelena still did not look at Hanjin. Her eyes were only searching the shadows in the forest. However, she did not continue to struggle and let Hanjin grab her wrist. Hanjin looked at Yelena helplessly. After a while, he sighed and withdrew his hand. As soon as Han Jin let go, Yelena released a levitation spell and flew straight into the air. She chased in the direction that the elves had escaped. The magic wand in her hand kept waving, shooting out lightning balls one after another. It did not matter if there was no target, and she did not want to find one. As long as there was something to do, as long as she could forget the heart-wrenching pain, she would be satisfied. Nine Thunder Descent was a signature spell that could only be released by a top-grade professional. However, a magus without any defense was also an irresistible temptation. Although the elves were scared out of their wits, under the influence of the great temptation, they did not run far. Instead, they spread out and hid in the depths of the forest, waiting quietly. As soon as Yelena's figure approached, several shadows shot out from the forest towards Yelena from various angles. However, Yelena, who refused to face fate directly, ignored these attacks, just like how Han Jin had ignored her. Without thinking, she raised her hand and released a few lightning balls in return. A green light shot out. Han Jin stretched out his left arm, hugged Yelena's waist, and dodged to the side. Several arrows hit his back in an instant. Then, Han Jin pointed his sword finger and the green light slashed downward. In a deafening boom, a large black hole was blasted open above a small hill. The next moment, Han Jin flew into the hole with Yelena in his arms. Yelena became restless again and struggled with all her might. Han Jin was worried that Yelena would use too much strength and sprain her own arm, so he could only trap Yelena in his arms again. No matter how violent Yelena was, he did not dare to let go. After a long while, Yelena finally calmed down, but Han Jin felt a headache coming on. He had promised Guevara not to hurt Yelena. Even if he couldn't keep his promise, he couldn't just bring a dead Yelena back. That kind of result was not only unacceptable to Majordomo Gale and Guevara, but also to himself. Time passed little by little, and the surroundings were silent. If Nine Thunder Descent was the signature spell of a magus, then the green light was Han Jin's signature spell, and it was a unique one. The leader of the elves saw the green light. After all, he came from isolated Cliff City, so he immediately recognized the opponent in front of him and immediately ordered everyone to retreat. If he had known this would happen, he would not have done it in the first place. Han Jin regretted not using that method to reject Yelena. He should have found a gentler way, but how? Han Jin did not know. His mind was in a mess. Regardless of whether Yelena was wise or not, she had always been rational and knew what she should and should not do. Therefore, Han Jin had overestimated Yelena. No matter what, Yelena was not even 20 years old today. She was just a little girl. If you don't cherish me, why should I cherish myself? Since ancient times, countless girls had walked down the wrong path because of such thoughts until they could no longer turn back. Although it sounded childish, from another perspective, the fact that they did this proved that in their hearts, you was far deeper and more important than me. Yelena finally quieted down, but Han Jin still did not dare to let go. He was still scared. Fortunately, most of the elves were weak. If there was an elven ranger, Yelena would have been shot to death. In such a short time, he had no time to save Yelena. In fact, the distance between life and death was not measured in seconds, but in milliseconds. The two of them stood in each other's arms like a pair of lovers. Han Jin's chest should have been warm, but Yelena kept shivering as if she was in an endless snowstorm. Tears kept dripping from the corners of her eyes, and more of them flowed, almost forming a line. Han Jin was clumsy. He did not dare to let go of Yelena, nor did he know what to say to comfort her. He could only remain silent. At this moment, every minute was extremely unbearable for him. Similar problems had caused headaches for many true heroes who valued relationships. Even Gao Bin found it hard to make a choice back then. In the end, he chose that woman. One reason was because the elders had tried to influence his decision and sent people to attack that woman maliciously. Another reason was because elves had a long lifespan. Therefore, he decided to accompany that woman for the rest of her life before using the rest of his time to make up for Hazel's pain. It was a good idea, but he did not know that the grief-stricken Hazel betrayed Wild Willow City and willingly became a night elf. After wandering for dozens of years, he sought refuge under Zagund. Gao Bin, who had been isolated from the world, did not know what happened later. The funny thing was that he could still remain calm, laughing and cursing because he did not know anything. He also did not care about Hazel's identity as a night elf. To him, as long as he worked hard, everything could be salvaged. Happiness was only because of ignorance. Of course, ignorance was not derogatory. If you love someone, do you have to destroy the other person? Han Jin and Gao Bin, who had never met before, would face the same problem sooner or later. It was just that one's mind was full of contradictions, while the other's heart was full of sorrow and sorrow. After an unknown amount of time, Han Jin felt that Yelena in his arms seemed to have recovered. He let out a sigh of relief and said softly, "Yelena, let's calm down and have a good talk, okay?" He had never been so grateful to the elves. With Yelena, who was not afraid of death, he could not fight at all. It was even more dangerous to drag her underground. Yelena's desperate struggle would destroy his Taoist spells. He could escape, but Yelena would be trapped alive. Fortunately, the elves gave up attacking. He had decided to forgive all the elves in the city as long as they were willing to leave. I ask you," Yelena said in a slightly choked voice, "when you found out that Sunir had married someone else, was it very, very painful?" Han Jin was stunned for a moment. Yes, he saw himself very clearly. When he faced the elves and madly vented his deep-rooted hatred, what he could not hide was the same feelings that were engraved in his heart. "Then do you know what I feel?" Yelena's voice trembled even more. Han Jin was silent. He was really speechless. "Let me ask you again. If you had never met Sunir, would you fall in love with me?" Yelena suddenly raised her head and stared at Han Jin with her red and swollen eyes. All this time, they'd been playing riddles with each other. One knew what she was doing, and the other knew what the other wanted to do, but neither of them said it out loud. Today, Yelena finally said those two words. Han Jin looked at Yelena's haggard face and suddenly thought of saying, "A beauty's favor is the hardest to bear." He took a deep breath and said without hesitation, "Yes. I don't want you to pity me." Yelena's body suddenly trembled. "I won't force myself to make a promise just because I sympathize with someone," Han Jin said softly. "Just like what you did just now, right?" Han Jin smiled bitterly. He did not know how to answer. However, seeing that Yelena's mood had improved, he changed the topic. "It's getting late. Should we find a place to rest first? There are still many things to do, Harley." Here, following his words, Harley's figure appeared in front of him. However, his skull hung low as if there was something on the ground that required his attention. "Look around and see if there are any elves ambushing us." Yes, Harley was exceptionally clean today. He was a man of few words and did not say anything unnecessary. He turned around and flew out of the hole in the roof. In fact, Yelena's terrorist attack just now had frightened him. After seeing that the situation was getting stranger and stranger, he did not dare to make a sound. If he attracted Han Jin's attention, he might vent his anger on him. A moment later, Harley appeared at the hole again. He looked down and then floated down. They ran away. What ran away? They all ran away. Make it clear. Han Jin frowned. Harley felt even more wrong than Yelena. In the past, he had made things clear and added a lot of his own explanations, but he was always scolded. Today, he finally tried to be concise for once, but still could not satisfy Han Jin. "Master, there are not many elves in this city. I think there are only 500 or 600 of them. I mean the living ones. If you include the dead ones, there are about 600 or 700. Nonsense." Harley felt so wrong that he wanted to kill himself. Just like Yelena, his tone became very low. They all retreated. I just saw their backs on the city wall. "Master, do you want to chase after them? You can take care of Madame Yelena here. Don't worry and leave the things over there to me." "Oh, right. They also left the Tree of Life." "Ha, that thing is too big. I don't think they can move it." Okay. Han Jin waved his hand impatiently and interrupted Harley. "Master, then, do you want to chase after them? I just said that there is no need. You didn't say that just now. You just said okay." Harley saw that Han Jin's expression was not right and hurriedly shut his mouth. He swore that he would never speak again before the sun came out. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chijian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 338. Flowers bloomed everywhere in the secluded valley. Occasionally, a light breeze would blow past, and countless seven-colored petals would gently sway with the wind. An intoxicating fragrance would then fill every corner of the valley. Looking from afar, the entire valley seemed to be covered with a layer of colorful and gorgeous feather clothing. However, the incongruous thing was that the deepest part of the valley was filled with a thick black fog. It was like a beautiful landscape painting that had been sprinkled with ink. A white tiger with a pair of wings flew over from afar. It first circled the sky above the valley a few times, but when it didn't find the prey it was expecting, it flapped its wings and flew into the distance. Unfortunately, the direction it was flying in wasn't right. He believed that it must be wondering why there was such a large black fog in the valley that it often hunted in. However, its low IQ probably couldn't figure out the answer to this question. Even if it could, it wouldn't have the chance to. The moment the white tiger flew above the black fog, a hole suddenly appeared in the black fog, revealing a bottomless hole. The white tiger seemed to be pulled by a strong suction force, and its body fell straight down. It only had time to let out a cry before it stopped breathing. The black fog that had spread out quickly closed up again. From afar, it was still the same gloomy fog, as if nothing had happened. The only difference was that the area covered by the black fog seemed to have expanded and the fog was thicker. That was all. Sunir, who was still far away, obviously didn't know what had happened in the valley. Looking at the corpse of the giant snake at her feet, she felt a little regretful. This type of snake was getting harder and harder to find. Sunir had killed at least 20 giant snakes so far. She guessed that there weren't that many of these snakes in the Trial's illusion. Of course, if these venomous creatures were rampant, there would be no way for other creatures to survive. Sunir also noticed a problem. The further she went, the fewer monsters there were. According to Seth, this was close to the area where the rainbow dachira flower grew. It was the most dangerous place in the Trial's illusion, so Sunir was more careful when she walked. Light seeped through the gaps between the branches, illuminating Sunir's face. The scars around her wounds had already fallen off, leaving only a few reddish marks. However, they weren't ugly at all. Instead, they added some sharpness to her beautiful face. In the following days, Sunir was rarely injured. Her archery skills were getting sharper, and her reaction speed was improving day by day, which made it easier for her to kill the prey. Often, Sunir's arrows would pierce through the heads of her prey before they could even attack. A cruel environment often trained a person's willpower. In a situation where she couldn't communicate with nature, Sunir faced the same problem as everyone who had tried to attack the fairies in the forest. Every time he took a step, he had to consider whether something would break out of the ground. Every time he leaped, he wished he could grow a pair of eyes on his back, because he would never know which tree was hiding a ferocious beast eyeing him covetously. In an environment where she had to keep one eye open even when sleeping, those with weaker willpower would have gone crazy long ago. The ever-present danger made Sunir's nerves tense. She didn't dare to relax at all. A rock not far in front of her suddenly rolled. Two thick, black tails with sharp spikes extended from behind the rock. Sunir didn't even think before leaping into the air. At this moment, the two spikes touched each other, and a white electric light shot out, brushing past the bottom of Sunir's boots. Sunir grabbed onto a branch that was hanging down to the ground. Without stopping, she used a bit of strength and continued to swing her body upwards. At this moment, the second electric light followed and hit the spot where Sunir had just stopped, making a crackling sound. At the same time, the arrow in Sunir's hand also shot out, firmly nailing one of the two tails to the ground. Sunir was already very familiar with this kind of twin-tailed scorpion. The two tails had to touch in order to shoot out electric light. Moreover, wherever the tip of the tail pointed, the electric light would follow. As long as she hit one of the tails, the twin-tailed scorpion would no longer be a threat to her. Without waiting for Sunir to stabilize her body on the tree, a black shadow silently pounced down from above. It had to be said that this black shadow's attack timing was perfect. It was right at the moment when Sunir's arrow hit the target and her mind relaxed. Sunir's heart suddenly felt a sense of danger. Without turning her head, she waved her hand, and an exquisite dagger appeared in her hand. The black shadow suddenly let out a miserable cry. At the same time, a few drops of warm and smelly liquid splashed onto Sunir's neck. Sunir's heart was happy, but she didn't dare continue to stay on the tree. Her body leaned backwards, and she flipped upside down. At this time, Sunir was finally able to clearly see the appearance of the black shadow. It was a creature similar to a leopard. There was a deep wound on its neck that was currently spurting out fresh blood. Sunir's dagger didn't cause any fatal damage to it, but it completely aroused its ferocious nature. It didn't care about the bleeding wound and angrily roared. It pounced down from the tree and chased after Sunir, who was still in midair. From the top of the tree to the ground, it only took a few breaths of time. However, it was already enough for Sunir. Sunir flipped her wrist, and the dagger in her right hand shot out. It shot directly at the left eye of the leopard. Following that, Sunir pushed her left arm forward and pulled back her right hand. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, a black light flashed through the air and disappeared into the leopard's bloody mouth. The roar came to a sudden stop. The leopard's remaining eye suddenly protruded out and immediately lost its life. Sunir's arrow had completely cut off its life. Just as Sunir's head was about to touch the ground, Sunir promptly arched her body. At the same time, she slapped the ground with her palm. Borrowing the force, she bounced up. Her two legs slanted out, and she collided head-on with the falling leopard. The leopard's enormous body was sent flying by Sunir's kick. On the other hand, Sunir stood firmly on the ground. She raised her hand and shot another arrow. The arrow slanted and shot underneath a rock. The ground beneath the rock trembled a bit, and from the place where the arrow had shot into, black blood gushed out. From encountering the twin-tailed scorpion to breaking the leopard's ambush, everything happened in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. The battle had ended in an instant. After surviving for such a long time in the trial and paying the price of a body full of scars, Sunir was not without any gains. Right now, she had already trained her spiritual sense to be sharper than ordinary people. Many sneak attacks from behind her were dodged by her in the nick of time. That was purely an instinctive reaction when danger approached. Sunir sighed and continued to walk forward. She walked all the way until the sky gradually darkened. She did not encounter any more sneak attacks. Logically speaking, to the current Sunir, being able to have some peace and quiet for a while should be something that she could only wish for. However, Sunir's heart was indescribably perturbed. If it was in the past, Sunir would have to walk a bit more before stopping to rest if there was enough visibility. However, for some reason today, the uneasy feeling in her heart was growing stronger. Just as Sunir decided not to walk anymore and was about to find a place to rest, a few faint roars suddenly came from afar. Although the sound was not loud, it was very clear. Sunir looked in the direction of the sound and saw a few white dots rapidly approaching from afar. Sunir could not help but frown. For elves who did not have the ability to fly, these kinds of magical beasts that could freely soar in the sky were especially troublesome to deal with. The white dots flew very quickly, and it did not take long for Sunir to clearly see that they were white tigers with wings under their ribs. Sunir recalled Seth's words. These tigers could use sound waves to hurt people. Although this sounded a little unbelievable, Sunir did not want to personally experience the power of sound waves. She quickly found a hollow tree hole and hid in it. Relatively speaking, this was the safest place for her to be. She only needed to deal with the enemies in front of her. The white tigers did not stop at all and directly flew over Sunir's head. The strong wind pressure caused by the flapping of their wings was so strong that even the treetops were bowed down. Sunir was not sure if these tigers really did not notice her. She continued to hide in the tree hole until the sound of flapping wings had faded into the distance. Sunir thought to herself that it would not be a bad idea to rest here for a night. Peace returned to the forest. Fortunately, the night here was not too cold. There were no detestable dewdrops or mosquitoes flying around. There was only a hollow silence, so quiet that Sunir could clearly hear the sound of her own breathing. This period of time was usually the most unbearable. Traveling alone in this unfamiliar world was not the day after day of killing or the endless number of monsters, but the loneliness that seeped into one's bones. Those who lived alone were either wild beasts or gods. Sunir was not a wild beast and could not reach the heights of a god. Putting aside her identity as a descendant of God, she was actually just an ordinary female elf. She also had expectations and longing in her heart. Before that, Sunir had never thought that she would be able to accept love. The words descendant of God were like a dazzling halo, which made most of the elves flinch at the sight of it. Everything was relative. The noble bloodline brought honor to Sunir, but at the same time, it also brought her a heavy responsibility. At the very least, she could not be like Julia, who liked someone and could follow him to the ends of the world. It did not matter if that person was not an elf, because no one would blame Julia. However, Sunir was different. She was a descendant of a god and the hope of Wild Willow City. No matter where she went, this fact could not be erased. Sunir smiled bitterly in her heart. Where's my hope? Sunir took out the piece of wood that was full of scratches from her space ring. After thinking for a bit, she put it back. In her hand, there was a fiery red charm. Sunir had never seen the twisted characters on it before. Using her slender fingertips to trace the strange runes, Sunir seemed to see the serious expression of that person when he was making the charm. Such a charm, he must have spent a lot of effort, right? Sunir felt that she could not see through Han Jin anymore. He would always do some unimaginable things. For example, the thin piece of paper in her hand actually contained a destructive power that could destroy heaven and earth. Moreover, it did not have any magical fluctuations. If she told others about it, she was afraid that no one would believe her. However, Sunir believed him. If he said he could, then he definitely could. In her memory, that person had never disappointed her. However, this time, did I disappoint you? Sunir regretted coming back to Wild Willow City. If she had known that she was going to marry Prudence, then Sunir would never have come back. She really did not expect that the always kind elder would lie to her. Thinking of this, Sunir's heart was somewhat angry. Sunir knew nothing about what was happening outside. She would never have dreamed that Wild Willow City had already launched an attack on Han Jin. Of course, the elder would not tell Sunir about this kind of secret. It was really a pity that he did not tell Sunir. Otherwise, Sunir would have done her best to stop him. Then, this kind of thing would not have happened in the future. The elder had also never asked Sunir about Han Jin. If he had asked, she believed that he would have carefully considered it. Han Jin was like a dormant volcano. Those who had not experienced it personally would never understand the horror of the moment it erupted. What was even more frightening was that this volcano was still growing day by day. Sunir thought that her marriage was too simple. This was not a simple matter of the blood of God. Even if she really married Prudence, it would still take a long time for their child to grow up. However, some people could not wait that long. This was only an opportunity for Wild Willow City to finally have enough confidence and courage to take the first step in the struggle for hegemony. However, there are many things that once you took the first step, you would never be able to stop. Those people did not know that once they took the first step, what would greet them would not be heaven, but hell. The fog in the valley seemed to have been nourished, and it was much stronger than it had been a few days ago. Wherever the fog touched, the 7-colored Datura flower's vitality seemed to have been sucked dry by something, and it quickly withered. The gorgeous 7-color petals also lost their luster, and were suffused with a layer of dead gray. Not far from the area covered by the black fog, several winged, white tigers were circling around. From time to time, they would roar fiercely at the black fog. Waves of sound waves that could not be detected by the naked seemed to distort the air. Wherever the sound waves reached, the black fog would immediately disperse, revealing the grayish-black ground below. However, it did not take long for the dispersed black fog to quickly close up again. This situation lasted for a long time. Finally, the larger tiger in the lead finally lost its patience. It first flew high into the sky, then suddenly swooped down, shooting diagonally towards the center of the black fog. Its fully extended wings, which were several meters long, brought about a strong wind pressure. Even the thick black fog seemed to be afraid of its fierce momentum, rolling and dispersing in all directions. The white tiger rushed into the center of the black fog without any hindrance. As it rushed forward, it flapped its wings vigorously, trying to disperse the annoying fog around it as much as possible. It seemed to have achieved this. Wherever it rushed, the fog would be swept away by the wind pressure it carried. However, it did not notice that behind it, the fog quietly gathered together again, so that its companions outside could no longer see its figure. A bottomless hole appeared in front of the tiger. The gloomy aura emitted from the hole made it immediately begin to feel uneasy. Its beast instinct told it that there was something very terrible in the hole. The white tiger let out a shrill howl, flapping its wings again and again, trying to fly high and escape. However, its diving speed was so fast that it did not have time to change direction. It just rushed straight to the hole. From the outside, the black fog only rolled for a moment before returning to calm. However, what frightened the remaining white tigers was that their companions never appeared again. They wanted to turn around and leave. They were a little unwilling, but they lacked the courage to rush in. A few white tigers circled around the black fog, their mouths constantly letting out angry and helpless cries. It was not clear how strong these white tigers were, but their voices were not soft. Even from so far away, their voices could clearly reach Sunir's ears. Sunir was awakened by the sound from afar. After frowning and thinking hard for a while, she walked in the direction of the sound. It sounded like a battle had happened there. Although Sunir did not want to participate, it just so happened that the 7-colored datura flower grew in that direction. Not long after, a few more roars came from the opposite direction. Sunir turned her head and saw a few white dots in the sky. She quickly found a place to hide. Not long after, a few white tigers whizzed over at lightning speed. As they roared, they flew over Sunir. Sunir was a little confused. What was there? Could it be the nest of these white tigers? It seemed that Sunir's guess was very accurate. One roar after another sounded from afar. One by one, the white tigers flapped their huge wings and flew over Sunir. It was as if there was a delicious meal there that was attracting them. Seeing this scene, Sunir hesitated. She could not deal with such a large group of tigers. The speed that the elves were proud of was not worth mentioning in front of these flying tigers. She could at least watch from afar, right? Sunir found a reason for herself to move forward. The stubbornness in her heart finally prevailed. Although her original intention was to escape, Sunir was not willing to leave empty-handed. Besides, the conditions of the trial were very simple, weren't they? Find the 7-colored datura flower and bring it back. That was all. If she couldn't even do such a small thing, she was afraid that she would have to stand behind that person forever. Having a broad shoulder to shelter her from the wind and rain was something that most women would want. However, Sunir was not one of those women. She only wanted to face it together with her lover. When there were no more sounds of wings flapping in the sky, Sunir came out from her hiding place and carefully walked forward. In the distant valley, the roars of the tigers became even more mournful. Chapter 339. Order didn't seem important in normal times, but once it was lost, it would often turn into a disaster. After the elves occupied Nuremberg, they didn't kill everyone in the city. The human population was too large. Even the most radical elves didn't dare to think about completely wiping out the human race. They just punished a group of disobedient people and locked them up in the southern district of Nuremberg. However, The city's library had been destroyed by the elves. Under Han Jin's proposal, Lang Ning built libraries in several satellite cities of Black Raven City. Of course, the size of the libraries was very small. Compared to the other world, the library's information capacity was even less than that of a small bookstall. The books in the libraries only recorded some simple poems and stories, as well as some basic knowledge of magic and fighting energy. Han Jin's library was free of charge. As long as anyone wanted to, they could come to the library to read for free. This was because he had built his foundation with his bare hands. Although there were many strong people around him, he lacked middle and lower class talents. Han Jin's proposal was strongly supported by others. Although it wouldn't be effective in the short term, there had to be a start. It was because of the books about magic and fighting energy that the elves were so angry that they destroyed the libraries. A long time ago, when the other powerful races and even the elves became the rulers, the status of humans had always been very low. In terms of strength, humans were inferior to orcs. In terms of intelligence, humans were inferior to dragons and elves. Even if you took into account other things like weight, appearance, and so on, humans had no advantage at all. No one knew when it happened, or what kind of price they had to pay, or even who the initiator was, but someone had learned magic. At the same time, the human warriors had also created the combat aura that only humans could master. Since then, the humans had gradually revealed their talents, and after thousands of years of accumulation, they had finally become a race that was weak individually, but their overall strength was the strongest on the continent. The elves and the Senate had reached a consensus on how to eliminate the threat of humans. They admitted that most humans were good and kind, and only a small number of professionals were the root of the disaster. If they killed all the professionals and cut off the inheritance of human magic and fighting energy, it wouldn't take long for humans to become lovable lambs again. Therefore, he must not show mercy to those that should be destroyed. The elves fled from Nuremberg in a hurry. Without guards, the remaining humans were in a mess. Some of them wanted to flee to other places with their families, while others thought that it would be the same no matter where they fled. However, some people couldn't control their bad habits anymore. They searched everywhere for valuables, and some even took advantage of the situation to rob their own kind. Han Jin had no time to control the situation. Yelena had already given him a headache. Fortunately, as time went by, Yelena's mood gradually stabilized. Just now, Han Jin braced himself and said that he would go back to the Holy Crown City tomorrow, but Yelena didn't have much reaction. She just looked up at Han Jin for a moment and said that she was a little tired and wanted to go back to rest. Han Jin was worried, but he was powerless to do so. Could he follow them? Things had gotten to this point because he had rejected Yelena in such a blunt manner. If he really let it go, not only would all his previous efforts be wasted, but he would also be confused. After thinking for a while, Han Jin stretched out his hand and flicked the bracelet. Then he raised his chin in the direction of Yelena's departure. Harley understood and quietly followed Yelena, turning into a blue smoke. Han Jin didn't know whether Yelena could fall asleep, but he knew that he couldn't. He couldn't even regulate his breath. His eyes were unfocused, and he kept walking back and forth in the room. The elves had completely transformed the city. What was originally a nice room was now covered with vines and a few unknown flowers that were quietly blooming. It was completely against the laws of nature. Every 100 breaths, an extremely weak wave would come from the center of the city. The vines in the room would tremble slightly with the wave and then return to their original state. This kind of wave was difficult to sense, but it could be seen with the eyes. The problem was that Han Jin didn't have the energy to think about other things. The power of the Tree of Life wasn't just about transforming the environment. Frankly speaking, if Prudence hadn't issued the order to retreat as soon as they saw Han Jin, the elves in the city would have fought to the end. If he wanted to kill all the elves in the barrier formed by the Tree of Life, Han Jin would have to put in a lot of effort. In other words, he could now destroy the Tree of Life. Without the elves' control, the Tree of Life was just a giant tree full of vitality. This would make countless elves cry. In fact, Han Jin had already planned to do this, but now he had forgotten. Hanjin's expression was very calm. The bloody baptism had settled too many things in the depths of his heart. Even if Jed's and Majordomo Gale were here, they wouldn't be able to see what was on Hanjin's mind. However, there was a fierce debate going on in his mind. Still unmoved? That was a pure lie. Men and women were different. Not to mention the hidden meaning in the phrase, if a man pursues a woman, there's a mountain between them. If a woman pursues a man, there's a paper between them. A woman would only give her heart to a man when she really loved him. But for a man to accept a woman, there were other things that couldn't be avoided, such as responsibility and pity. Some people said that accepting a woman because of pity was a kind of blasphemy. However, since ancient times, countless brave men had bowed their heads in front of this kind of blasphemy. The reason why a woman should be cautious could be explained in common words. People always said that if so and so married someone, the former would definitely be a woman. The word marry was easy to understand. The word give was, of course, a kind of gift, a kind of sacrifice. It could even be said that whether a woman's life was happy or not depended not on her talent and wisdom, but on whether she gave to the right person. Female confidence existed since ancient times, but it also depended on whether the man was a good wine or not. What headache! Hanjin heaved a sigh. In the Holy Crown City, many people had already regarded Yelena as their future wife. Without Sunir, who was most qualified to be with Hanjin, even his most trusted friends were divided into two groups. Morrison's belonged to the emotional group. He believed that Sunir wouldn't suddenly marry someone else and should at least come back and explain it to them. Sasu belonged to the rational group. He believed that Sunir had no choice between the whole race and her personal feelings. As for Sunir coming back, it was even more ridiculous. The elves were already preparing for a war. How could they let Sunir come back? Seeing that Harley didn't say anything, Hanjin knew that Yelena should be fine. He took out a few magic crystals from his space ring and slowly sat down on the bed. The bed was covered with grass, and the familiar smell of grass reminded Hanjin of the world of Warcraft Forest. At that time, the hut he lived in was also in such an environment. Hanjin felt upset. He suddenly stood up, grabbed the edge of the bed, and threw it to the side. The big bed spun and hit the opposite wall with a loud bang. Countless grass and vines were crushed and scattered everywhere. The abnormal state was only temporary. Hanjin soon calmed down. After tidying up the messy bed, he lay down on his back. Suddenly, light footsteps came from the door, and a figure came in from outside. Hanjin hurriedly sat up. Yelena, why are you here? Haven't you slept yet? Yelena stood in the faint shadow of the moon, lowered her head, and didn't speak. Just now, did I wake you up? Hanjin smiled and said, Sorry, I was tidying up the bed. I was careless and used too much strength. Yelena lowered her head and still didn't speak. It was a bit awkward to talk to himself, but Hanjin's tone became gentler. Yelena, what's the matter? Yelena still lowered her head, and her hands were twisted in front of her body. She looked very uneasy. Hanjin was helpless. After thinking about it, he could only change the topic. Where's Harley? Why don't I see him? In fact, Hanjin could completely sense Harley's position. He was just looking for something to talk about. Yelena raised her head little by little, her lips trembling. After a long time, she suddenly said in a voice as soft as a mosquito, I've decided. You. Hanjin was stunned. Yelena, what do you want to do? I'm stupid, really. I just want to be closer to you, but you're getting farther and farther away from me. In the past, you often cared about me and chatted with me, but now you're always trying to avoid me. This time, you didn't want to take me with you, right? Tears fell from Yelena's eyes. But what can I do? I don't know what I should do. Although I've been trying to make you happy, you must hate me, right? I'm such a fool. Yelena, no. Hanjin smiled bitterly. Why would I hate you? I want you to forget Sunir. Can you tell me what I should do? Yelena stared at Hanjin, her whole body trembling. At this time, Hanjin realized that Yelena wasn't wearing a magic robe, only a thin inner skirt. He said in a reproachful tone, Yelena, it's winter now. Why did you come out wearing so little? After saying that, he went to take off his cloak. Of course, His main purpose was to change the topic. He couldn't answer Yelena's question at all. No need. Yelena's voice trembled even more. It'll be over soon. Over? Hanjin suddenly had a bad feeling. Can you tell me? How can I make you forget sooner? Yelena didn't forget the topic just now. Hanjin fell into silence. After a moment, he said in an uncertain tone, maybe in a few days, but you're going back soon. I don't have time. Yelena suddenly smiled. Her smile was extremely sad, and sorrowful. Since you don't have a way, then I'll have to use my own way. After saying that, Yelena reached out and touched the sash on her shoulder. What are you doing? Hanjin faintly sensed Yelena's intention and hurriedly reached out to grab her wrist. If you don't want me to hate you for the rest of my life, let go of me. Yelena said word by word. I don't want to sully your eyes. I just want to find a release for myself and for you. Well, what release? Hanjin's rhetorical question was somewhat weak. In Yelena's eyes, he could clearly see the burning fierceness and determination. From tomorrow onwards, I won't bother you anymore and won't cause you any trouble. We can still be friends, right? Ha! Yelena's smile became even brighter. Hanjin retracted his hand little by little. He didn't flinch when facing Alquit. He didn't flinch when facing Zagunt. He still didn't flinch when facing the notorious Whip Brothers. It could be said that ever since he met with Lang Ning's army at the Bite Man and truly embarked on the path of hegemony, he had never flinched in the face of any threat. However, when facing Yelena's eyes, which were completely different from before, he flinched. Hanjin didn't even dare to look at Yelena. Every time they met, it felt like something was stabbing at the tip of his heart. Thank you, Yelena said with a smile, but her hands were still slightly trembling. In fact, that kind of skirt was easy to untie, but it took her a long time to untie one of the buckles, and then she changed to the other shoulder. Her inner skirt slipped off, and so did her underwear. Yelena's body was like a natural and perfect jade sculpture, completely exposed in front of Hanjin. Her white and smooth skin shone under the faint moonlight, and her moving curves had a soul-stirring beauty. However, Hanjin didn't dare to look at anything. He only lowered his head and stared blankly at the falling dress. Okay, I've done everything a woman can do, including my shame and what you might think is lewd. Do you want to scold me? Scold me all you want. Use your angriest roar. Use your sharpest. Ha! Yelena was laughing, but tears were dripping down her cheeks. After that, I have no more regrets, really no more regrets. Hanjin felt like a soft spot in his heart had been stabbed, and his eyes were a little hot. This wasn't because of the perfect body in front of him, but because of an unbearable weight. Friend, can I go now? It's all over. Shouldn't you say something? Yelena had used up all her strength and willpower to hold on until now. Finally, there was a trembling sob in her voice. Hanjin bent down little by little, grabbed Yelena's underwear, and put it on Yelena's shoulders. He then carefully put it on Yelena, and then grabbed the underwear. At this moment, he truly understood the meaning of tenderness. It was a man's bone, his bone. No matter what happened in the future, he would never forget Yelena, nor would he ever forget this day, nor would he ever forget what Yelena had said. Yelena didn't resist. Like a puppet, she let Hanjin do whatever he wanted. Tears kept dripping down her cheeks. In fact, she wasn't a girl who liked to cry. Even when she was seriously injured, she could still endure and restrain herself. For as long as she could remember, all the tears she had shed couldn't compare to today's. Yelena, I am not worth it, Hanjin said softly. Is this the last thing you want to say to me? Yelena smiled sadly again. Accepting you is accepting a fate. Yelena, I haven't thought about it yet. Can you give me a few more days? Hanjin said softly. As he spoke, he reached out and gently wiped away the tears on Yelena's face. His expression was very solemn. Hanjin wasn't being an alarmist. This was indeed a fate. Not only did they have to share secrets, but they also had to stay by each other's side. For a cultivator, this was true forever. Yelena didn't want to take any chances. She just wanted to be free as soon as possible. She had just tasted her first love and didn't expect that loving someone would be so painful. She couldn't bear this torment anymore. However, Han Jin's words and his gentle touch gave her a glimmer of hope. She couldn't believe it, and because she was already mentally and physically exhausted, her body swayed and fell to one side. Han Jin picked Yelena up by the waist and strode out until they reached Yelena's room. Harley was walking around in the room. When he saw Han Jin carrying Yelena into the room, he didn't say anything and turned into smoke. He rushed out the window and floated outside. Yelena wasn't in the mood to take care of herself. Her magic robe was thrown carelessly on the bed, and on top of it was the priceless wand. Han Jin knew that Yelena had always treated the wand as a treasure. One could imagine how chaotic her heart was right now. Han Jin walked to the bed and carefully put Yelena on the bed. He then got up and was about to leave. Yelena subconsciously grabbed his hand, but then timidly retracted it. She wanted Han Jin to stay for a while, but she was worried that she would ruin the opportunity she had given everything for. "Have a good sleep," Han Jin said softly. "We still have to hurry tomorrow." Yelena's face turned pale again. Han Jin saw this and added, "We'll go directly to Black Raven City." He had changed his mind and wasn't in a hurry to go back. At least, he couldn't go back before he made a decision. Yelena heaved a sigh of relief. Her eyes lingered on Han Jin, but she was too tired today. Not long after, her eyes slowly closed and she fell asleep. While Yelena was sleeping, dozens of silver Pegasi were running quickly 100 miles away. There was also a handsome unicorn among them. The leader was Prudence. Beside him was a female elf with long, silky golden hair. She was slender and beautiful, and there was a floating headband on her forehead. It was Sunir. Behind them was Sheila and Rueli. There was also a human floating in the air. There was no magic wave or light of fighting power. He was just floating naturally, and his speed was no slower than that of the silver Pegasi. Running up a hill, Prudence whispered a few words to the elves around him. Then he pointed his finger in the direction of Nuremberg, because there was only one place in the area where the elves gathered, and that was Nuremberg. Chapter 340. Han Jin and Yelena hadn't been able to sleep for long because they had stayed up late last night. Han Jin was fine, but Yelena looked a bit haggard. The breakfast was tasteless. Han Jin maintained the attitude that the less he spoke, the less he would make mistakes, while Yelena didn't know what to say. After breakfast, Han Jin invited Yelena to go out for a walk. Yelena hesitated for a moment before accepting Han Jin's invitation. Shopping was equally boring. To ease the awkward atmosphere, Han Jin talked about Nuremberg, the cavemen, and his impressions of the various races in the abyss. However, Yelena was not interested in this topic and rarely interjected, let alone discussed it. Later, Han Jin also shut up. Bright sunlight penetrated through the gaps between the vines, turning the whole of Nuremberg into a colorful world filled with lights and shadows of all sizes. A warm fragrance filled the air. It was the smell of all the green vegetation. If he could remove the psychological influence, Han Jin had to admit that this fragrance was very pleasant and comfortable. It was not easy to create such a world in the endless ice and snow. Unfortunately, because of Sunir's betrayal, Roland had no good feelings for the elves or this refreshing green world. After the elves left, those who could escape had already done so. Those who were left were those who didn't want to escape or couldn't. In the corners of the city, the screams and cries of men and women could be heard from time to time. Occasionally, there would be cheers and laughter mixed in. The overall character of each race on this continent was very distinct. Usually, it could be described in a few words or even a sentence. Only humans were difficult to describe. An abyss demon who didn't want to kill would definitely be ridiculed, despised, and ostracized by his race. An orc who loved poetry and was sentimental would probably have been killed by his own race. The overall personality of humans could be said to be all-encompassing. Sometimes, they could be crueler than the abyss demons and more violent than the beastmen. Sometimes, they could be more cultured than the elves and more holy than the angels. There was no way to evaluate them specifically. Anything I said would be wrong, and there would definitely be examples of the opposite. Hanjin didn't want to poke his nose into other people's business. Hearing the commotion in front of them, he was about to take Yelena to another road when a commotion suddenly broke out in front of them. More than 10 men in disheveled clothes ran towards Hanjin while howling like ghosts. When they saw Hanjin, who was dressed in tight clothes, and Yelena, who was holding a magic wand, they immediately screamed and turned around to rush into the alley. A dark orb chased after them from the front and ran amok among the men. Every time it flashed, it brought up a rain of blood. In a moment, all the men were lying in pools of their own blood. "Harley, what's going on?" asked Hanjin, frowning. "This is too vicious. Really vicious." Harley shouted impulsively. "Master, go ahead and see for yourself. You'll understand." Hanjin shook his head slightly. "Yelena, let's go in another direction." Harley himself wasn't a good person. Only God knew what kind of thing could make Harley feel compassion. "Master, we shouldn't have come. Let the elves kill them all." Harley was still shouting. "I suddenly feel that the elves, enough." Hanjin cut him off. Suddenly, all the green plants in the city began to dance at the same time. The vines and trunks swayed as if they were all alive. Their movements were very rhythmic and clearly showed a kind of joy. "The elves are back." Hanjin immediately reacted. He smiled faintly. "Let's go and see what they're going to do to us." Harley, "Understood, master." Without waiting for Hanjin to speak, Harley knew what he should do. He immediately floated up, and in the blink of an eye, he passed through the vines and rose into the sky. In the north of Nuremberg, about 5 or 6 female elves were approaching the city at a moderate speed. The elf in the lead was Sunir. The elves behind her were chatting and laughing. Their crisp and pleasant laughter could be heard from afar. This was not a troop on an expedition, but a group of girls who were out for fun. Harley was the first to discover the elves and shot over. When he was about a kilometer away, Harley suddenly stopped. Then, as if he had seen the most terrifying thing, he flew back as fast as lightning. "Yelena, I'll send you to the Abyss World first." Hanjin whispered to Yelena. "They must be prepared this time. It's dangerous." "No." Yelena shook her head slowly. Hanjin smiled bitterly. "Well, okay." At this moment, Harley shot down from the sky and immediately returned to his original form. However, his expression was somewhat uneasy. Even though he didn't have any distinct facial features, others could still clearly sense the changes in his emotions. "Harley, did you find anything?" Over there, over there." Harley stammered. "A few elves came." "Only a few?" "6 in total." Harley calculated in his mind. "You didn't attack?" Hanjin was a little surprised. With Harley's nature, no matter how many elves came, he would rush up and attack. This was understandable. Harley had been holding back for too long. "No, no. Are you uneasy?" Hanjin whispered. "Are they very powerful?" "No, master, they are very weak." "What do you mean by very weak?" Hanjin felt that Harley was speaking incoherently. "Master, you'd better go and see for yourself," Harley said with difficulty. If he could sweat, Harley would have been covered in cold sweat. Hanjin had retained his intelligence, so, of course, he had his own plans. Master and Yelena's relationship had just begun, and now Sunir had come back. What would happen if they met? Chaos, chaos. Everything was going to be chaos. When Hanjin appeared in the north of Nuremberg, the elves were already close to the city. Hanjin could clearly hear their happy laughter. Then he saw the female elf in the lead. Although they were 400 or 500 meters away, he immediately recognized her. Her pretty eyebrows, her exquisite figure, her silky, smooth golden hair, and the ribbon in front of her forehead were all very familiar to him. Hanjin was stunned, as if he had been struck by a thunderbolt. Hatred, nostalgia, pain, and unwillingness were all intertwined at this moment, setting off waves in his heart. As if there was a connection that could ignore time and space, Sunir suddenly stopped. She stretched out her arm and stopped the elves behind her. A pair of eyes as bright as the sky turned to Hanjin's position. Then, Sunir showed a horrified expression. Obviously, she recognized who was in front of her. She hesitated for a moment, bit her lips hard, and then turned the silver Pegasus around and galloped back in the direction she came from. Soonier, Han Jin let out an earth-shattering roar. All the anger, confusion, and even hatred that he had accumulated for a long time all exploded at this moment. Without thinking, he immediately released the ground shrinking spell and chased after Soonier. However, the silver Pegasus that Soonier was riding was unusually fast, even faster than a dragon. Looking from afar, it looked like a silver arrow flying between the sky and the earth, even roaring like the wind and thunder. Han Jin made hand gestures and cast the earth-shrinking spell. Then, after a slight pause, he would appear more than 100 meters away. Then, he would start making hand gestures again. Even though he was moving at such an unimaginable speed, he could only slowly close the distance between them. A green forest appeared in front of him. It covered an area of about 1,000 meters, and it was as conspicuous as Nuremberg in this white forest. However, Han Jin ignored it. He didn't have the energy to think about it. Seeing Soonier rush into the forest, he followed closely. Although he couldn't release the ground shrinking spell for long distances in the forest, the silver Pegasus couldn't run at full speed either. Han Jin moved like crazy, and his vital energy was at its peak. He chased after Soonier's figure, quickly weaving through the forest. Suddenly, Soonier in front of him cried out in alarm. The silver Pegasus fell head first, and Soonier couldn't help but fly out. She rolled into the grass, flashed a few times, and disappeared without a trace. The next moment, Han Jin appeared where Soonier had disappeared. Just as he was about to rush into the grass, his body suddenly stopped. An elf lightly jumped down from a tree behind him and stood there quietly looking at his back. Han Jin slowly turned around. His gaze swept across the elf and then fell on the silver Pegasus that had fallen. The Pegasus was still alive. As its four hooves kicked, blood gushed out, dyeing the grass around it red. "Lord Raphael, nice to meet you." The elf bowed slightly, revealing a meaningful smile. Han Jin's gaze turned back to the elf. He was a very feminine male elf. He had a pair of emerald green eyes, clear and deep, bright golden curly hair, and a high nose bridge. Under the straight nose bridge were cherry lips. Yes, cherry lips. If this male elf wore a dress, no one would suspect his gender. If this was another world, and Han Jin was in a good mood, he might have smiled and asked the elf, "Korean?" But now, Han Jin couldn't smile. He felt a sense of danger. In other words, the elf was giving him a sense of pressure. His appearance made people feel that he was as delicate as a woman, but that didn't mean that they could underestimate his strength. Prudence? A trap? Han Jin said calmly. "Soonier cooperated with you to set a trap for me? Do you really want me to say it clearly? What's the point?" Prudence smiled. "The facts have proven everything." As soon as Prudence said those words, rugged tree roots stretched out from the ground and crawled all over the ground, connecting together and making the whole ground look like an undulating ocean. Han Jin could feel the wriggling under his feet. That's right, it really was a trap. They were afraid that he would escape through the ground. Han Jin's eyes were a little dazed, but he quickly recovered. Actions always spoke louder than words. Soonier had used facts to prove her choice. In front of the entire elven race. How childish and ridiculous was love? Was there a need to explain? Fine. Since it's come to this, let me put an end to you and your entire race. All of his anger turned into a burning desire to fight. But his expression was still calm. He looked around as if he was admiring the scenery. "Do you think this will work? If it was just me, it's hard to say." Prudence's smile was a little shy, but I have friends. A figure floated down from the leaves and stood quietly behind Prudence. His appearance was very ordinary, but the clothes on his body were extremely luxurious. He was wearing gold and jade, and he looked like a chief visiting a foreign country, or a bride who was about to get married. "Let me introduce you. This is Lord Maxwell from Dragon City." In the Draconic language, Maxwell is a very influential and respectable person. Prudence smiled. "Are you doubting me?" TSK, TSK. Your eyes are just right to prove that you are shallow. Lord Maxwell has already mastered the ultimate shape-shifting skill. Do you know what this means? Maxwell smiled proudly as he listened to Prudence's introduction. You don't know? This means that Lord Maxwell has broken through the final barrier. Prudence let out a long sigh. Oh, Han Jean smiled. You're the dragon, Slayer Raphael? Maxwell felt that he should say something, but he purposely used Han Jin's title, which was full of undisguised contempt and provocation. His meaning was obvious. Aren't you the dragon slayer? Let's see how you slay a dragon. Huh. Han Jin smiled again. A green light shot out from his mouth and turned into a giant sword more than 30 meters long. He didn't like to talk, especially at this time. No matter how much he said or shouted, it wouldn't ease the pain in his heart. What the elves and Sunir had done to him could only be washed away with blood. Proverb. Maxwell opened his arms, and an indescribable wave of magic gushed out from his mouth. The trees and grass around him trembled, and an invisible tremor instantly swept across a radius of more than 10 miles. Even the sky darkened for a moment. Then, he uttered a syllable that no one else could understand, just like how Han Jin was chanting a magic incantation. The next moment, Maxwell pointed his finger at Han Jin. Han Jin suddenly felt his whole body go numb. A thick darkness spread out from his chest and quickly covered his whole body. He couldn't control any of his muscles, and his whole body turned into a statue. The green light that was about to attack also froze in the air because it had lost Han Jin's telepathic will. It was a very scary feeling. It was as if he was sealed in a 10,000-year-old iceberg. He couldn't even move his fingertips. Not only that, Han Jin also found that his telepathic abilities were gradually fading. There was a slight ringing in his ears, and at the same time, his vision began to blur. He could still see things at close range, but things in the distance had turned into a fog. Moreover, he could see that Prudence was speaking, but he couldn't hear what he was saying. Han Jin's vital energy was running at full force, but it couldn't fight against this feeling. He clearly judged that his 6 senses were slowly collapsing into the endless darkness. It wouldn't be long before he became a statue that couldn't hear, see, walk, or feel anything. Maybe he could still think, but what was the use of that? Lord Maxwell, is it okay? Prudence smiled. Ever since he invited Maxwell, the elder of the dragon race, he didn't have to worry about Han Jin. The difficult part was finding Han Jin and not letting Han Jin escape. Wait a minute, what's the rush? Maxwell's voice was very hurried and contained dissatisfaction. He then took a deep breath and said, no matter how strong a dragon is, it's impossible to cast the proverb twice in a row. Okay. Prudence shrugged his shoulders. Maxwell's face had become pale, and his chest was rapidly heaving like a dwarf's bellows. The proverb seal was the most powerful enchantment spell in the dragon language magic. Of course, it was a negative enchantment. The power of the proverb seal could even block time and space. Even if the proverb seal existed for tens of thousands of years, nothing would change after the seal person regained his freedom, including age, memory, and so on. Although, as an elder of the dragon race, the long years had given him endless magic power, but Maxwell couldn't bear the wear and tear. At least, he couldn't cast the proverb seal continuously. After a long while, Maxwell let out a long breath. Prudence slowly raised his bow and smiled. I've been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. After saying that, he pulled the bowstring, but the corner of his eyes drifted to Maxwell. Maxwell slowly opened his arms. Proverb. Obviously, they had enough understanding of Han Jin's magic and were preparing to launch an attack on Han Jin, who had come back from the dead. At this moment, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky and hit Prudence. Then, several more bolts of lightning fell in succession. Yelena, who was quickly approaching, then cast teleportation and appeared beside Han Jin. A faint magic light curtain appeared out of thin air and firmly wrapped Han Jin in it. Huh! Prudence smiled as if nothing had happened, but his eyes were full of interest. Yelena's appearance amazed him. Even among the elves, It was rare to see such a beautiful woman. Seal. Yelena showed a horrified expression. After all, she was a magus and had profound knowledge in the field of magic. She knew what this strongest curse meant. Her eyes fell on Maxwell, and she said in a trembling voice, "Superior dragon, get out of the way. I don't want to make things difficult for you." Prudence said softly. He was a gentlemanly elf, and he didn't want to hurt such a beautiful woman. The magic staff in Yelena's hand dropped bit by bit. She knew that she was no match for any of the strong elves in front of her. Then, a heartbreaking beauty bloomed on her face. "What I owe you, I'll pay you back today." The next moment, Yelena's magic staff pointed to the sky with an incomparably firm posture, and huge lightning pillars fell straight down. 9-grid thundercall. Chapter 341. The lightning bolts struck the ground, creating large and small craters. Broken branches and leaves flew everywhere, and dust made of sand and stones rose into the air. However, Maxwell and Prudence remained calm, letting the lightning bolts strike their bodies. Maxwell did nothing and used his own body to receive the lightning bolts, while Prudence's cloak fluttered without any wind, turning into an impenetrable green barrier, completely covering him. Yelena smiled again. She had expected that her magic would not work, so she smiled even more poignantly. Then, she raised her wand again. "Bastard! Kill her!" Maxwell roared. "Do you want her to alert Raphael?" An idea flashed through her mind. She seemed to have caught on to something. She abruptly turned around and prepared to cast a spell at Hanjin. Prudence had already released his fingertip, and a powerful arrow shot out. It disappeared in a flash, and then the arrow miraculously passed through the obstruction of the magic shield. It appeared out of thin air inside the magic shield and shot into the middle of Yelena's back. An archer like Prudence could almost be regarded as the nemesis of all magicians. His arrow of time and space could pass through all barriers and appear in front of the target. If one wanted to fight against Prudence, one must intercept the arrow of time and space as soon as it appeared, just like Dismark in the Holy Crown City. Otherwise, one could only wait for death. As a group of magicians, they did not have the advantage in terms of reaction speed. In a split second, they could not even complete a spiritual lock, let alone intercept it. Furthermore, Yelena was only a magister, while Prudence was already a 12th level master. Along with a rain of blood, the arrow pierced through Yelena's chest and hit the other end of the magic barrier. With a loud bang, the magic barrier covering a radius of more than 10 meters was destroyed by this small arrow. Yelena was hit by a powerful force and then fell to the ground, but there was an inexplicable smile on her face. If Hanjin did not have another life, she would be powerless because it was impossible for her to break the seal. But now it was much easier. As long as she attacked Hanjin, Hanjin would wake up from the seal. As for her own injuries, she did not know and did not want to know. However, she could no longer release any magic. The unbearable, heart-wrenching pain made it impossible for her to gather her spiritual power. She could only use her arms to support her body and crawl toward Hanjin bit by bit. 2 meters. 1 meter. The distance that could be crossed in a few steps in the past was so far away for Yelena. A bloody hole had been created in her chest, and blood was gushing out like a fountain. Yelena dragged out a bright red path of blood. "What are you waiting for, Prudence?" Maxwell roared. He was abnormally angry. He was interrupted while he was releasing a forbidden spell, and the disturbed elements almost caused a magic backlash. All of this was because of that damned woman. Prudence took a deep breath, pulled out another arrow, and knocked it on the bowstring. With another sharp whistle, the arrow shot into Yelena's thigh like a bolt of lightning. Prudence used his strength skillfully and nailed Yelena to the ground. Yelena's outstretched hand stopped in midair. If she moved forward a little bit, just a few inches, she would be able to grab Hanjin's calf, and then she would be able to push Hanjin down. But these few inches became an insurmountable obstacle. Yelena's hand drooped down little by little, and the light in her eyes disappeared little by little. Finally, she could no longer move, and she couldn't even control her eyelids. Slowly, she closed her eyes. Fate was particularly cruel to Yelena, but it was even more cruel to Hanjin. Before he lost all his vision, he saw a girl standing in front of him resolutely, resisting two super-grade masters like a mantis trying to stop a car. Then he saw the girl suffering a fatal attack and falling under him. Then he saw the girl clenching her teeth and crawling toward him bit by bit, only to be nailed to the ground by the enemy. These bloody scenes were unbearable for him. From the beginning to the end, Hanjin had always been at the forefront. He would appear where the most dangerous place was. He even fought against Zagund, Alquid, and all the warriors in the underground city alone because he was afraid of what he would see. But today, what he feared had finally happened. It was irresistible. He didn't even have the right to avoid it. He could only watch helplessly. Prudence shook his head. He didn't know whether it was out of pity or helplessness. Then he turned his gaze to Maxwell. In order to take full control of the situation, he had to cooperate with Maxwell. Who knew what other magic Raphael had? If something went wrong, it would be big trouble. In the distance, a whirlpool of smoke and dust was shooting toward them, mixed with Harley's incoherent roars. Because Yelena and Sunir were about to meet, Harley was worried that he would be caught in the crossfire, so he decided to stay far away. He ran around the city, taking care of the injustices, killing the unjust, and imagining himself as a great hero. It was a great pleasure, but when he was at his happiest and most carefree, he suddenly sensed that Hanjin wanted to die. Hanjin wanted to die. Realizing this, Harley really went crazy. He desperately rushed over to help, but unfortunately, judging from the time and distance, he wouldn't be able to make it in time. Maxwell closed his eyes and quietly recovered his magic that had almost been disturbed. After a moment, he opened his mouth and said, "Proverb." Prudence raised his longbow and aimed the arrow at Hanjin's forehead. Maxwell spat out the draconic language again, and an extremely intense wave of mana swept out in all directions. The wave did not have any effect on the environment, but it shocked all the creatures with senses. Prudence shot an arrow at the same time. The sharp arrow whistled through the air and hit Hanjin's forehead. With a bang, Hanjin turned into countless splashes of sand and stones. The next moment, his figure appeared in another place. Maxwell's incomparably strong mental strength immediately locked on a Hanjin. He pointed his finger, and before Hanjin could react, his body became stiff again. Prudence's eyesight was very good. He could clearly see that at the same time, there was a pair of eyes filled with grief and indignation. Prudence couldn't help but laugh out loud. "What? The powerful Lord Raphael? Are you feeling desperate and sad?" "Prudence, it's your turn," Maxwell said weakly. He had released 2 forbidden spells in a row, and he had almost suffered a mana backlash midway. This had exhausted his mental strength, and he even felt like he was about to collapse. As an elder of the dragon race, the amount of magical power he had accumulated over countless years was as boundless as the sea. It was hard to believe that he was so tired after releasing 2 spells. But it must be known that the Proverb Seal was the most terrifying and powerful enchantment forbidden spell. The effect was always proportional to the result. As long as he could release the spell completely, Maxwell could seal any opponent of the same level as him. The reason he could become an elder was because he had mastered the forbidden spell that even the dragon race was afraid of. Prudence laughed and reached for the quiver. He liked the feeling of being in complete control, so he slowed down his movements because he wanted to enjoy it for a while longer. The giant sword that had been hovering in the air began to tremble, and then suddenly burst into a dazzling light. The light was supposed to be gentle, but at this moment it seemed so violent, so sharp, and so strong. Even with Maxwell and Prudence's experience in battles, they were still shocked and couldn't help but close their eyes. Following closely behind the rays of light was an indescribable wave of air. The countless roots that were crawling on the ground were swept away, and even a layer of the ground was scraped off. At the edge of the wave of air, the sand, stones, and dust were swept up into the air and swept out in all directions. Sunir, Sheila, and the other elves were waiting 1,000 meters away. The battle between the super-level masters was too far away from them, both geographically and personally. Now that they suddenly saw the overwhelming wave of air rolling toward them, they couldn't help but scream and turn around to flee. However, the speed of the air wave was so fast that it caught up with them in just a few breaths. All the elves, including Prudence's mount and the dozens of silver Pegasi, were all swept into the airwave. It pushed them hundreds of meters away before the airwave's impact began to weaken, and the elves were mercilessly thrown to the ground. Sheila and the other elves were all bruised and battered. More than 20 elves were never going to wake up. They were all badly mutilated. Even Prudence's mount, the golden unicorn, was injured in the leg. It was limping and whining in pain. The silver Pegasi were even more miserable. They could only glide and couldn't fly freely in the air. It was easy to imagine what would happen if they fell from a height of dozens of meters. Maxwell and Prudence were indeed super-level masters. They were able to remain unharmed in such a violent wave of air. However, this was only the beginning, not the end. The dazzling sword began to shatter. Like a gigantic crystal ball, it was peeling off layer by layer and shattering layer by layer. Countless sharp shards shot out in all directions with the sword as the center, covering the sky, the earth, and the entire world. Prudence roared, and the green cloak behind him suddenly fluttered, wrapping his body firmly inside. The next moment, Prudence turned into a green afterimage, like a spirit snake, like a wisp of wind, fleeing outside at an incomparably fast speed. But the speed of the countless sharp fragments was much faster than his. Every fragment that passed by his afterimage would leave a bloody mark, which made Prudence feel unbearable pain. However, he didn't dare to relax at all. He used all his strength to continue to fly away. The more serious the injury, the more painful the injury, the faster he escaped. Maxwell stared blankly for a moment, but it was only because of this moment that he lost his last chance. Then, a magic scroll appeared in Maxwell's hand. With a burst of violent magic fluctuations, a semicircular barrier appeared around Maxwell. It was actually a top-level light elemental defensive spell, Absolute Barrier. The sharp shards kept hitting the Absolute Barrier, leaving unhealed scratches. No matter what kind of magic it had to be in a state of elemental order to be effective. If the scratches on the Absolute Barrier couldn't be healed, then the light elemental order would completely collapse. In just a few breaths of time, the Absolute Barrier turned into countless scattered specks of light. Maxwell swung his right hand, and another Absolute Barrier appeared. What was frightening was that as soon as the first Absolute Barrier disappeared, the second Absolute Barrier appeared. This happened in the blink of an eye, but thousands of tiny wounds appeared on Maxwell's body at the same time. His gorgeous robe was riddled with holes, and more than half of the dazzling ornaments on his body were destroyed. Maxwell's face became somewhat distorted. He was clearly aware of the current danger. There were too many fragments that were thousands of times denser than the resplendent starry sky. They were everywhere, pervasive, and possessed extremely terrifying destructive power. Death. This word, which had never appeared in his dictionary, suddenly appeared in his mind. The moment the second Absolute Barrier was destroyed, Maxwell, who had already learned his lesson, immediately released another Absolute Barrier. However, he still couldn't help but let out a painful howl as countless wounds appeared on his body. Droplets of blood seeped out and connected together, turning him into a bloody man. The shape of the greatsword kept shrinking, and the shards that burst out became more and more concentrated. Within a radius of 1,000 meters, it had become a world of flowing light. With a boom, the third Absolute Barrier was also destroyed. This was Maxwell's last Absolute Barrier scroll. He howled in pain as he continued to cast spells. In this moment of life and death, Maxwell displayed the strength of an elder of the dragon race. In the blink of an eye, he released spells such as Magic Shield, magic shield, earth shield, stone skin, and so on. He also released high-grade defensive spells such as flame shield, air shield, and even earth wall. Among these spells, there were spells that the orcs, humans, and abyssal races were proficient in. He could be considered to be very knowledgeable. However, none of these spells could last for more than a second. Almost at the instant the effects of the spells were released, the elements collapsed. In fact, the most effective spell was teleportation. Maxwell naturally mastered this spell, but the problem was that the whole world had become a flowing light. He couldn't see anything and couldn't lock onto his position. This meant that he couldn't establish a spatial channel. The abyssal demon was killed by Han Jin in a similar situation. Maxwell kept howling in pain. In the end, he simply canceled the ultimate transformation spell and turned into a huge golden dragon more than 50 meters long. He then spread his wings and was about to fly away. An extremely spectacular scene appeared. In just an instant, the wide wings became a broken sieve. Countless broken and shattered dragon scales flew in all directions at the same time, like a huge, blooming flower. Maxwell's painful howls were deafening and could be heard more than 10 miles away. He desperately ran away. Flying in the blue sky was a basic ability of dragons, just like how humans could walk. As a superior dragon, he was forced to run on the ground. He had to admit that this was a kind of tragedy. Comparatively speaking, Prudence was very lucky. He had already escaped from the attack range of the fragments, but he had also paid a heavy price. The cloak that he cherished as much as his life had already turned into countless fluttering pieces of cloth. Moreover, countless wounds had appeared on his body. The clothes on his back had simply disappeared, revealing his bloody back. Even his equally bloody buttocks and a pair of long legs were exposed. Prudence didn't dare to stop for a moment. He jumped onto his mount, grabbed Sunir with one hand, and grabbed Sheila with the other, and roared, "Go! Let's go!" After he finished speaking, he urged the unicorn to flee into the distance. Seeing that Han Jin could release a spell, Prudence's first thought was that Han Jin had broken free from the seal. The power of the spell was so great that it was far beyond their expectations. If they didn't run now, he was afraid that he would lose this opportunity forever. The giant sword became smaller and smaller, until it was the size of an ordinary person's index finger. Suddenly, an even brighter multicolored light blossomed, and with a loud bang, the green light disappeared without a trace. The multicolored light that filled the entire world was several times denser than before, and Maxwell, who was running, was suddenly thrown into the air. In just an instant, his incomparably huge body shrunk several times, and countless pieces of flesh and blood were peeled off and splattered everywhere. Maxwell's body rolled a few times before crashing heavily onto the ground. He slowly raised his head, let out a whimper, and then powerlessly drooped down. He had already lost most of his scales and most of his muscles. It was as if someone had skinned him alive. In some places, even his bones could be seen. Even for a dragon, this kind of injury was fatal. The stream of light continued to spread outwards in a frenzy until it reached thousands of meters away and caught up with the fleeing elves. Their bodies were not as tough as the giant dragons, and as soon as they came into contact with the stream of light, they turned into splatters of flesh and blood. At this moment, Prudence had already escaped far away. Although the golden unicorn had injured its leg, it still maintained an unimaginable speed. At least, it was much faster than the elves who had lost their silver Pegasi. Prudence looked back and saw the scene of the elves being smashed into pieces. He couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air and ran even faster. Sunir and Shira Rueli were dumbfounded. They had not only seen their companions being slaughtered, but also saw a huge dragon flying up into the sky and then falling down powerlessly. They knew who it was. It was Maxwell, the elder of the dragon clan. Even Maxwell, who had broken through the final barrier and was close to becoming a demigod, was no match for that human. It was too scary. At this moment, the initiator of all this, Han Jin, was standing there like a statue. If Prudence suddenly turned around, Han Jin would be dead for sure. The question was, did Prudence really have the guts to do so? In that world, Hanjin and his master were a bit strange. One was facing the last threshold, the last test, and the other had just stepped into the door of cultivation. Hanjin's master couldn't even decide which path was the most suitable for Hanjin. He could only choose to teach Hanjin by force-feeding him, forcing him to learn all the Taoist scriptures. Furthermore, the Taoist arts that he taught Hanjin step by step were all methods that would harm oneself before harming the enemy, allowing the weak to defeat the strong. This was because Hanjin wanted to go on alone without anyone to back him up. If he encountered a powerful cultivator, he could only rely on these methods to protect himself. Hanjin had asked his master what this method was called. His master pondered for a moment before answering with a smile. Of course, with his master's sour character, he would have named it after a poem, but it was a poem that had been tampered with. Don't be afraid of being smashed to pieces. Keep your life in the world. His master's explanation was like this. As long as you have the chance to use this method, you won't have to be afraid of anything. You will definitely be able to keep your life. Hanjin sneered at his master's explanation. He even found a junior high school language book and strongly requested his master to study the grammar seriously. In the end, he named this method Breaking the Void, thinking that this name was more impressive. As expected, his request was rejected and he was punished for his transgression, but he had already memorized this method. The talisman that triggered "Don't be afraid of being smashed to pieces" was in the green light, but he couldn't do anything after being sealed by magic. From the moment Prudence attacked to the moment when he was sealed again, Hanjin only did two things. First, he activated the talisman and sent a telepathic thought to Yelena. After such a long time, when all the talismans in the green light were added together, the total amount of energy was close to the realm of primordial. Therefore, the explosion of the green light was as terrible as the self-detonation of an earthly immortal. The world finally returned to normal. Maxwell trembled and slowly opened his eyes. Then he struggled to lift his claws and crawled forward little by little. He was almost skinned and had his muscles shaved, but he was still alive. His perseverance was as tenacious as Yelena's, but Yelena was trying to protect him while he was trying to save his own life. Maxwell crawled another step forward. At this moment, a muffled whistling sound came from afar. Harley had finally arrived. Harley was the first to notice the huge monster in the distance. It was a strange-looking dragon. Without any hesitation, he screamed and rushed forward. Normally, Maxwell had countless ways to protect himself or attack Harley, but now he could only stare blankly and couldn't move at all. With a boom, blood splattered everywhere. Harley shot into Maxwell's eye socket, causing the dragon's eye, which was several times larger than a wash basin, to spray out crystal water. The powerful impact flung Maxwell's head to the side. The huge monster twitched a few times and stopped moving. No creature could withstand such a cruel attack. Then wisps of smoke floated out of the dark hole and condensed into a soul-devouring orb again. Harley moved and shot toward Hanjin. "Attack me! Attack me!" Sensing Harley's approach, Hanjin's heart roared wildly. Harley was a weapon spirit. If both of them were willing, they could communicate with each other. However, this connection was limited and vague, absolutely incomparable to real words. Harley was a little surprised. He didn't understand what Hanjin meant. "Attack me! Attack me quickly!" Hanjin's heart was screaming hysterically. He had realized that this terrible magic was tightly bound to his life. With Harley's ability, there was no way he could remove this magic. Thus, he could only rely on himself. To be precise, when his life became weaker, the power of this binding would also weaken. Only then would he have a chance to break free. As for whether Harley would misunderstand his intentions and simply blast a hole in his head, Hanjin couldn't care less. He could save people, and the supreme soul-sealing spell was a supreme Taoist magic that could save the dying and heal the injured. However, he could only save people. The longer he delayed, the less likely Yelena's life would be. Harley finally saw Hanjin. He also found that Hanjin had been sealed. He was shocked and scared, and his speed involuntarily slowed down. "Attack me! Quick! Hanjin's heart was still roaring. The vital energy in his body was running to the extreme, but this sealing magic didn't cause any substantial damage. He couldn't find a way to vent. Harley gritted his teeth and finally made up his mind. With a scream, he shot toward Hanjin's thigh. With a bang, Harley blasted a big hole in Hanjin's thigh and shot out from behind. Perhaps because he was sealed, or perhaps because he was too anxious, Hanjin didn't feel any pain. However, he found that the power of the binding had indeed weakened. Attack me. Attack me quickly. Hanjin was still shouting. Harley didn't know what was going on with his master. Was there a hidden enemy? When he hovered in the air and hesitated, he suddenly saw Yelena crawling on the ground, covered in blood. He suddenly understood everything. Harley screamed again and shot out from behind. Hanjin was soft-hearted and preserved Harley's intelligence. At this time, he finally got his reward. Harley chose the right side of Hanjin's back. If he chose Hanjin's heart or head, even if he didn't die immediately, saving himself or saving Yelena first would become a big problem. With a bang, a black smoke spurted out from Hanjin's right chest. At the same time, Hanjin was running his vital energy with all his might. Before the smoke settled, it turned into countless splashes of blood, splattering on the ground and Yelena's body. The thick black color covering his body quickly dissipated. Hanjin had finally awakened from the seal. The next moment, Hanjin staggered a step and knelt on the ground with one knee. His hand was already on Yelena's back. Harley, go away. Master, are you okay? Harley saw the blood spurting out of Hanjin's chest and was stunned. Did I do this? Oh my God, go away. Go away. Hanjin roared. He still retained some rationality. Otherwise, once he released the soul-sealing spell, Harley would be the unlucky one. Chapter 342. For Maxine was still peaceful. Sharpshooter Gal Bin's return was like a shot of adrenaline. The threat posed by the terrifying human lord was also reduced. Of course, they didn't understand the differences and conflicts between the higher-ups. But Lydia understood, and she had made her choice. That was why she came to a simple straw hut early in the morning. She had thought for a long time yesterday, but she couldn't figure it out. She had to get to the bottom of this. She opened the curtain and walked in. Galbin was standing in front of a mirror, carefully looking at himself. Galbin had the right to stay in the best room, but he didn't like it and insisted on building a straw hut in a corner of Fort Maxine. Lydia tried to persuade Galbin that even if he disliked the elders, he didn't have to suffer. Some of the clan leaders also tried to persuade him, but Galbin was stubborn. No one could persuade him. In the end, Lydia gave up. Galbin kept looking at the mirror and didn't respond to her. Lydia had to speak first. Can't you shave your beard clean? Is it not good? Galbin's face was full of narcissism. I feel like I'm filled with the beauty of a male soul. Lydia was angry and amused at the same time. You really are the same as before. What's wrong with before? Disgusting? Or what? Galbin said with a smile. How can you be an elf? Lydia smiled bitterly. Whether she liked him or not, she had to admit that Galbin was definitely an anomaly among elves. All right, Lydia. Galbin reluctantly put down the mirror on the table and turned his gaze to Lydia. I believe that you didn't come to me this early just to make fun of me. What's the matter? Lydia's expression became serious when they talked about business. She stared into Galbin's eyes and said slowly, Why do you support them? Support them? What did I support? Galbin was shocked. Prudence wants to, I know what you're talking about. Galbin cut her off. But I didn't support them. But you didn't object either. Not opposing means supporting? Galbin laughed. According to what you said, everyone in the world is either a friend or an enemy. I've already talked to Blanche and the others. They've all expressed their support for you. But you'll disappoint them. Galbin was silent for a moment before he whispered, Lydia, this is the art of struggle. Art? Is compromise a form of art? Lydia said, Galbin, I never thought that you would back down from something. Lydia was a little emotional because she was very disappointed. Before the joint meeting, she had been running around contacting all the tribe leaders. Her goal was to build a broad alliance to fight against the United Senate. Many of the tribe leaders had expressed their support, but Gao Bin did nothing during the meeting. He was almost silent the whole time, which made everyone's jaws drop. Retreat? Those fellows aren't worthy. Gao Bin sighed. The problem is, Lydia, if you push a dog too far, it will bite. Then let them come. Lydia's eyes were cold. Ever since Gao Bin left, she had been swallowing her anger, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't know what to do. Now that Gao Bin was back, she found her backbone and direction. There was no need to hide her edge anymore. Gao Bin was a little helpless. He was silent for a moment before he said softly, "All right, let's not talk about art. Let's talk about strategy. If I want to walk from here to the door, there are many ways. I can ignore everything and walk out in one breath. If the wind is too strong, I could take a step forward and then take half a step back to adjust my pace and recover my strength. Then, I can walk forward again. If there are traps in this house, then I have to be careful. It's best if I stick to the side and walk step by step. Anyway, as long as I can walk out, I will be the winner. Lydia, no matter what's in the house, whether it's wind or traps, I don't care. It's not bravery, it's stupidity." "I understand what you're saying," Lydia said slowly. "But what we need right now is not a strategy, but a powerful voice outside of the Council of Elders. Gao Bin, it's not that we don't have allies. In fact, we have a lot of allies. The Senate has always held all the power in their hands. The title of chief has become a meaningless title. As long as we get the support of the other chiefs and the support of the elves, we can even—" Lydia stopped abruptly. What she wanted to say was too rebellious. "What can we do?" Gao Bin smiled. Lydia gritted her teeth. She had nothing to hide in front of this guy anyway. "We can even take over the Senate. Lydia, you've grown up. You're no longer the little fool who only knows how to fight." Gao Bin sighed. "It sounds like this is what you're thinking. I'll try my best to criticize the Senate during the joint meeting. Then you and the other chiefs will support me. Then we'll find a way to mobilize as many elves as possible and take over the Senate." "What's wrong with that?" Lydia retorted. If it was someone else who called her a little idiot, she would have already shot an arrow at them. But when it came to Gao Bin, she didn't lose her temper at all. Besides, she had been treated the same way before, so she was used to it. Yes, but there's a small problem." Gao Bin smiled. "Let me give you another example. Let's say, I know you hate me and oppose me, but I suddenly hand you a sharp dagger. What does that mean?" Lydia frowned and fell into deep thought. There's no need for the Senate to hold a joint meeting. Those things can be dealt with in an internal meeting. But they called all the chiefs here. Don't you know what they're trying to do? Lydia suddenly realized that Gao Bin didn't have any power now. His influence and prestige were all based on his previous reputation. Gao Bin criticized the Senate during the joint meeting, but he didn't get any support. The chiefs suddenly turned against him and criticized Gao Bin together with all the other senators. Gao Bin's reputation might be ruined. Thinking of this, Lydia felt a chill all over her body. "You're saying they set a trap for us?" Lydia asked doubtfully. "How can there be such an obvious trap in this world?" Gao Bin smiled bitterly. "The Honorable Great Elder Amter is warning me. This is also a threat. I should stay put. I'll be asking for trouble." Lydia's heart was filled with bitterness. She didn't expect that everything she carefully planned would be so childish in the eyes of Gao Bin and Amter. It seemed that the Senate had already noticed her actions, but they didn't care at all. However, Lydia, the magic arrow, was just like Gao Bin. She was a different kind of elf. Her madness not only struck fear into the hearts of her enemies, but also her own kind. After being provoked, she did not back down. Instead, she hardened her heart and said, "So what? Prudence obtained the power of space from God's mark, and your power is just enough to restrain him. Plus If Great Elder Amter heard Lydia's words, he would be very distressed. He wasn't afraid of Lydia using her brain, but he was afraid of Lydia using her hands. In fact, Lydia had indeed persuaded some of the clan leaders, such as Blanche, but Uptulin never interfered or made any adjustments. He allowed the clan leaders to continue exercising their daily power and even spread anti-war opinions everywhere. In the end, it was because he was afraid that this madwoman would suddenly go berserk. The overall strength of the elves was relatively strong, but there weren't many real superior-grade masters. Prudence was one, Gaobin was another, and Lydia was definitely one. Compared to the other two, Lydia was the most admirable because she didn't rely on anyone. She relied on her own crazy and hard work to cultivate. I don't want to shed blood, no matter if it's ours or theirs. Gaobin heaved a soft sigh. If we make them bleed today because of our different ideals, then decades or centuries later, other elves may make us bleed because of our different ideals. This is a terrifying, vicious cycle that will never end. He did think of using a white knife to get in and a red knife to get out. Lydia was a lunatic in action, but he was a lunatic in the mind. There was nothing that he didn't dare to think about. His mind was filled with countless unimaginable things. However, he was an elf, and he knew what kind of crisis was hidden under the current situation. If possible, he really didn't want his own people to bleed. If we don't bleed now, we may bleed more in the future. Lydia said word by word. Why do you say that? Gaobin asked with a puzzled face. When the hatred accumulates to the point where it can no longer be resolved, there are only two choices. Either we kill them all, or they kill us all. You mean the human lord named Raphael? That's him. I think you think too highly of him. Gaobin smiled. He thought that the elves were wrong because they shouldn't have dreamed of restoring the glory of the elf empire. As for the Holy Crown City, it didn't mean much from the perspective of the whole continent. Do you want to know what Sunir said about him? What did she say? Gaobin asked with interest. She said that Raphael will become the most powerful professional on the continent sooner or later. His power can even surpass that of God. Gaobin's expression was very strange. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even you don't believe it? Ha! Lydia said slowly. I feel more and more sympathy for Sunir now. Gaobin, do you know? Although Ampugula raised her, because she is your sister, I care about her more than Ampugula. I pay attention to her all the time. Her strength and pride can't be conquered easily. Since she chose Raphael, I believe in her evaluation. Surpassing God, Gaobin scratched his head helplessly. This Major Domo Gale rushed up the stairs with a gloomy face. He rudely knocked away a few slave warriors and rushed into the room. On the big bed on the south side, Yelena was lying quietly. Han Jin, who was still wearing his clothes, was sitting on the bed and staring blankly at Yelena. Guevara and Jeds were also here. Major Domo Gale should be the last to get the news. Major Domo Gale's pupils shrank to the size of a needle tip. At this moment, he didn't hide his viciousness anymore. He walked step by step to Han Jin's back and said in a slightly trembling voice, Lord Raphael, can you tell me what's going on? Han Jin was still staring blankly at Yelena, as if he couldn't hear Major Domo Gale's question at all. Major Domo Gale couldn't control himself anymore. He grabbed Han Jin's shoulder and shouted, Tell me what's going on. Guevara sighed. With Major Domo Gale's personality, if he didn't say anything or just want to comfort Han Jin, then there would be a big problem. Major Domo Gale's reaction proved that he still trusted Han Jin. Because of trust, he was disappointed and angry. Major Domo Gale was suddenly stunned. He couldn't see anything from the back, but when he looked directly into Han Jin's eyes, he found that Han Jin's eyes had become extremely deep, like a bottomless abyss. Occasionally, there was a dazzling golden flash. His intuition told him that the young man in front of him had greatly improved his strength, but this didn't scare him. The muscles on his face began to twist again, and he opened his mouth again. At this moment, Guevara grabbed his arm. They were attacked. Raphael did his best, Guevara said softly. Guevara said softly, Don't worry. Raphael has very powerful healing skills. Besides, Jedi's is also here, so Yelena will be fine. Even if you don't believe in Raphael, you should at least believe in Jeds, right? What's it called? Major Domo Gale was impatient. I think it's called Maxwell. The atmosphere suddenly became dead silent. Guevara and the other two opened their mouths and stared at Harley with their eyes wide open. Harley was a little scared and shifted his position uneasily. You? Why are you looking at me? I'm not that damn dragon. I really can't imagine what kind of price the elves paid to invite Maxwell out. Guevara sighed and turned his gaze to Major Domo Gale. In front of Maxwell, it's already very good. Raphael was able to escape with Yelena. It's already very good. Guevara had an ulterior motive. He was blaming Major Domo Gale for being so agitated just now. What he meant was, if it were Major Domo Gale, would he be able to escape with Yelena? Escape? Ha! Harley had been controlling his voice so as not to disturb his master who was in a bad mood. But when he heard such a superficial judgment, he finally got carried away. Why should we escape? Guevara and the other two were dumbfounded. After a long while, Jeds said anxiously, You mean Maxwell? The Maxwell who mastered the proverb seal? Seal? That's right. When I arrived, Master had already been sealed. However, Master had also released his magic. Caw-caw. That Maxwell was lying there like a plucked old hen. Caw-caw-caw. Harley's reply was full of heroism. Comparing a dragon to an old hen was unprecedented. Raphael can still release magic when he's sealed? Jeds asked with great difficulty. Yes. The faces of Guevara and the others had turned pale. In fact, they should have been happy, but this news was even more shocking than killing Maxwell. They could not bring themselves to smile. This was simply a subversion of the highest law of the world. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 343. 3 days had passed, and Yelena still had not opened her eyes. However, no one dared to blame Hanjin anymore. Even Major Domo Gale, who was in the most pain, had forgiven Hanjin. If it was because Hanjin was too careless or for some other reason, Major Domo Gale would never let it go so easily. However, his opponent was Maxwell, the elder of the dragon race. So what could he say? Guevara was right. It was not easy for Hanjin to bring Yelena back. At least now, Yelena was still breathing and was not dead. Moreover, since he had already been involved, the risk was unavoidable. Following Grand Duke Solomon, Major Domo Gale had gone through countless choices. Some of them succeeded, and some of them failed. After all, Grand Duke Solomon was not a god. There were always mistakes made, and many people had sacrificed for Grand Duke Solomon's mistakes. In his opinion, there was still a certain gap between Hanjin and Grand Duke Solomon. Even the Grand Duke could not ensure that nothing would go wrong, so he could not blame Hanjin. Between emotions and reason, he chose the latter. The most important thing was that everyone was busy and nervous. Major Domo Gale did not have the energy to blame Hanjin for his mistakes, because Hanjin did not kill an ordinary dragon. How could Dragon City sit by and do nothing? The Holy Crown City was very likely to suffer from the ferocious revenge of the dragon race. In this chaotic world, justice was just a smelly fig leaf. No matter who needed it, justice could be hung in front of their crotch. From the perspective of the Holy Crown City, they were suddenly attacked by the elves, so of course they were righteous. The dragon race actually sent a dragon to participate in the war, which was purely aiding the evildoers, so they deserved to be killed. From the perspective of Dragon City, a noble elder was killed by a human, which was an insult they could never forgive. Influence was a very mysterious thing. No matter the situation, or the general trend, it was always mixed with a sense of involuntary feeling. At first, Major Domo Gale did not want to participate. He came to isolated Cliff City only to protect Yelena, but then Guevara appeared, and then Jedis appeared, which made Major Domo Gale tempted. The capital of elements and Fado City had been fighting for decades. The war between the two sides had evolved into a pattern, or even a habit. Major Domo Gale could no longer find the passion to start a business. It could be said that he had been lonely for many years. Major Domo Gale had carefully analyzed the situation in the surrounding area. Except for Chisholm's cold shadow city, which was a bit troublesome, the other cities, such as Zagun, Dismark, Mollyshun, and the elves' Wild Willow City, were not very strong. The Bite Man could even be ignored. However, Hanjin had many strong people around him, so it was only a matter of time before he conquered these cities. Joining this group was the icing on the cake, and building a deep friendship with a rising lord with a bright future. It was the best of both worlds. Moreover, regarding the issue of Grand Duke Solomon's successor, Majordomo Gale was most interested in Yelena. The Grand Duke's eldest son was narrow-minded and had a gloomy personality. He was even willing to kill his own sister, which disappointed Majordomo Gale. The Grand Duke's second son was too kind and unambitious. He was a typical, muddling young master. Only Yelena was the most malleable, and she was a magus. Majordomo Gale hoped that Yelena could grow quickly while assisting Hanjin in his expeditions. In the future, she would naturally be qualified and able to inherit the glory of the capital of elements. Later, when he learned that Sunir had left and gotten married, Majordomo Gale was even more ecstatic. A mountain could not accommodate two tigers. After Hanjin had eliminated the other lords, would he still be content? It would be very difficult. What if Hanjin extended his claws and fangs to the capital of elements? Now, the most worrying problem had been solved. As long as Hanjin and Yelena were together, everything would become their family matter. As for whether the future capital of the Grand Duchy would be set up in the capital of elements, Majordomo Gale did not care. He only cared about the inheritance of the Grand Duke's bloodline. However, it was easier to get on the boat than to get off the boat. Majordomo Gale only thought that it was just icing on the cake and taking advantage of the situation. Who knew that accidents would happen one after another? The distant ancestor of the vampires, Alquit, suddenly appeared beside Zagund with 7 more abyss demons. This was a blow to Majordomo Gale. If he had known that there would be so many powerful enemies, perhaps he would have forcibly taken Yelena away. Fortunately, Hanjin lived up to everyone's expectations. He solved all the headaches almost without the need for everyone's efforts. Majordomo Gale had just breathed a sigh of relief when the elves united again. The powerful army had formed an overwhelming advantage. The problem of the elves had not been solved, and Hanjin had killed another dragon elder. The pressure was too great. Majordomo Gale suddenly realized that he was really old. When he was with the Grand Duke, no matter how powerful the enemy was, they could still talk and laugh freely. But now, he seemed to be afraid of the slightest thing. But since he had already come this far, he could not back down. Was his life's wisdom going to be destroyed in a day? Majordomo Gale did not want to become a laughingstock when he was old. For the next 3 days, Hanjin rarely went out. Most of the time, he just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Yelena, who was still in a deep sleep. When he broke free from the seal, Yelena's aura was already gone. He used almost all of his vital energy to release the soul-sealing spell of the Most Exalted to revive Yelena. However, he was still a step too late. Although Yelena's body was constantly recovering, there were no signs of her waking up. Hanjin had only released the soul-sealing spell of the Most Exalted twice, and both times were for Yelena. He had no experience and didn't know what it meant, so he had to stay by her side. Majordomo Gale was not the only one who had no choice. He was the same. After killing Maxwell, although he had absorbed a large amount of energy, even more than the previous dragons combined, he had also paid a heavy price. The green glow had completely disappeared. There were primary and secondary magic treasures, and the green glow was his primary magic treasure. If he had a few more years, he was confident that he could condense energy in the green glow that was calculated by Tai. Even if he met Nicholas, he should be able to fight him. But now it was all in vain. It had been more than a year since he condensed the green glow. He had spent a lot of effort on the green glow, but the problem was, how many years did he have to waste? Did he still have time to condense a new magic treasure? Before he made his choice, he was on this shore, but his goal was on the other shore. In the middle was an ocean full of strong winds and stormy waves. Unless he did not go into the water, He could only go forward. If he took a step back, he would be doomed eternally. The enemy would not give him any time to rest. Not to mention the green glow being destroyed. Even if the god of war and other magic treasures were all destroyed and his vital energy was exhausted, he would not turn back. Master, Harley suddenly said softly. What's wrong? Hanjin woke up from his contemplation. Lady Yelena's face is not right. Hanjin's gaze fell on Yelena's cheeks and found that her pale face was gradually darkening. He could not help but be shocked and hurriedly reached out to grab Yelena's wrist. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk in the capital of elements. There was no one who did not know of Grand Duke Solomon's Duke's Mansion. The capital of elements was the largest and most prosperous city in the northeast region, and the Duke's Mansion was the #1 mansion in the capital of elements. No one could surpass it. Of course, this had to do with Grand Duke Solomon's position. The most important thing was that the Duke's Mansion was too big. It took up almost a sixth of the entire capital of elements. To put it bluntly, the Duke's Mansion was a city within a city. A few hundred years ago, this would have been a rebellious act. Did Grand Duke Solomon build a mansion or a palace? But now, no one cared about Grand Duke Solomon's business. Who had the right to do so? Who had the guts? On the west side of the Duke's Mansion, there was a lush woodland filled with the same kind of trees. Most of the trees were more than 30 meters tall, and the thinnest tree had a trunk diameter of more than 5 meters. If an ordinary person stood under the tree, they would be no different from a small insect. The color of the trunks and leaves was very strange. It was a fiery red without any impurities. Under their illumination, even the ground here was emitting a red light. If an experienced and knowledgeable bard saw these trees, he would definitely exclaim out loud. This was because these were all extremely precious fiery parasol trees, natural magical materials. Shields made from the trunks of fiery parasol trees had the ability to resist fire elements, and were a supreme weapon against fire mages. In the entire woodland, there was nothing but these trees, not even a single weed. The ground was also abnormally smooth, as if it had been paved with a layer of red tiles. In the sky, there was a huge magic circle that enveloped the entire forest. This was the restricted area of the Duke's Mansion. Only Grand Duke Solomon himself could enter and leave freely. Not to mention the soldiers and servants in the mansion. Even Grand Duke Solomon's second son, Edison, who was the most mischievous when he was young, did not dare to cross the line. An old man was strolling in the woodland. It was Grand Duke Solomon. In reality, he was only around 50 years old, but his appearance was far older than his age. His forehead was covered with knife-like wrinkles, and his sideburns were snow white. On his thin cheeks, there were age spots, and the largest one was almost the size of a person's fingernail. His shoulders were very wide, but his back was a little bent, as if he was carrying an invisible weight. Although the robe he wore fit him well, the material was very ordinary. He held a black cane in his hand, and his once slender fingers had now become bony, like withered bamboo. From head to toe, other than that old appearance that made people sigh, there was nothing out of the ordinary about him. If he walked out of the Duke's Mansion and onto the streets, he would immediately blend into the crowd. He walked very slowly because he had to stop after a few steps and violently cough for a while. Sometimes he would not cough and would only stand there and desperately gasp for breath. Because of his poor breathing and violent coughing, his face was slightly red and tears flowed out from the corners of his eyes. However, his eyes always carried a faint smile. It was a pair of very young eyes, clear and bright, and formed an extremely sharp contrast with his appearance. Suddenly, a large fiery red bird jumped out from behind a tree. It was about half a meter tall, and its feathers were incomparably bright. Looking from afar, the feathers were fiery red, but looking closer, one could see that every feather was flowing with a dense rainbow light. When it discovered Grand Duke Solomon, it immediately let out a resounding cry, opened its mouth, and spat out a fireball. It flew straight towards Grand Duke Solomon, and then it flashed behind the tree and disappeared. The fireball that the bird spat out was only the size of half a fist, but when it flew in front of Grand Duke Solomon, it was already about the size of a wheel. Furthermore, its flying speed was abnormally fast, and in an instant, it attacked Grand Duke Solomon's chest. Grand Duke Solomon stretched out his hand, and the wheel-sized fireball suddenly stopped moving. It was hard to imagine that the unbridled meteor would become so obedient, and then the fireball flew straight up into the sky. Grand Duke Solomon shook his head and continued walking forward. In that instant, he emitted a pressure that was enough to make an ordinary person's heart stop beating. But now he had returned to being an ordinary old man. The large bird waited for a moment behind the tree, and seeing that nothing happened, it curiously stuck its head out and looked at Grand Duke Solomon. Then it looked around as if it was looking for its own fireball. In the next moment, the wheel-sized fireball fell from the sky and smashed into the large bird's body. With a loud bang, dense flames soared into the sky. The large bird was caught off guard and was smashed flat on the ground, like a roasted chicken on a plate. However, it did not seem to be injured, and hurriedly jumped up and fled into the depths of the forest. In the depths of the forest, there was a large bird lying there quietly. Its crawling height was actually more than 10 meters tall, and the feathers on its body were emitting a dense luster, like bright pearls and like raging flames. Although it did not speak and did not move, it emitted an indescribable majesty. The large bird from before had already turned into a small bird. It was desperately jumping, flapping its wings, and chirping something. It seemed to be complaining, but also seemed to be complaining. The large bird looked down, and its fiery eyes were overflowing with warmth, laughter, and doting. Cough, 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 cough. Grand Duke Solomon's figure appeared, and the small bird was startled. It burrowed under the large bird's body and did not dare to come out. Grand Duke Solomon's footsteps were slow and difficult, and he had to stop from time to time to cough, pant, and rest. However, no matter how long the road was, there would be an end to it. He finally arrived in front of the large bird. From his figure, he was very small, but his expression was very calm. Before he raised his head, a hint of undetectable guilt flashed in his eyes. The large bird stared at Solomon for a moment, and suddenly said, "Your body seems to be getting worse. Old. It's all like this." Solomon revealed an unconcerned smile, and then slowly said, "Old friend, have you thought it through?" The large bird was silent for a moment, and softly said, "All these years under your protection, I have lived a very peaceful life, but I can't help you with anything. Perhaps now is the time for my child to repay you for me." "You are wrong. There is nothing to repay between us. I helped you, and you helped me." Solomon paused. "This is only a request made as a friend. I do not want to force you, and I do not have the right to force you. You can refuse. But to me, if it were not for you, I would have turned into dust." The large bird sighed, and then extended its bright and beautiful wings. It carefully picked up the small bird and placed it in front of Solomon. "I only hope that your descendant can truly treat my child as a life and death partner." The small bird did not understand what was going on. After it landed on the ground, it discovered that Solomon was standing behind it. It was so frightened that it screamed and dove under the large bird. Solomon coughed violently again, and then panted for a moment, and slowly said, "You do not need to doubt the friendship between them. She is my child, and no one can understand her better than I do. If you do this, Jared will hate you for the rest of his life." The large bird said softly, "Don't tell me you want me to choose Jared. I guess, if that is the case, you will definitely refuse me." Solomon laughed. The large bird sighed softly and did not say anything. "Besides, I have never minded others hating me," Solomon said faintly. Solomon said faintly, "Hatred is just a way for the weak to comfort themselves when they are helpless. But Jared is still your child. Because of this, I cannot choose him." Solomon sneered. "He only knows how to hate. He hates this and that, but he never reflects on himself and never thinks about how to do better." "Ha! My evaluation seems to be a bit too extreme. Seriously speaking, if he were in my position, he would be able to do one thing well. What is it? He destroyed my elemental capital. In this regard, Edison and Yelena cannot compare to him. But I think that among your 3 children, Jared is the smartest, the large bird said softly. But this is your family matter. You do not need to care about my opinion. Smart? Petty tricks will not achieve great things. And a smart person who only knows how to scheme against his own people is destined to be pitiful. Solomon shook his head. He is like a poisonous snake. Other than being hated, what can he gain? Although he has many friends, they are only with Jared out of fear. They are afraid that they will become the target of attacks. If Jared is at a disadvantage, there will be countless feet stepping on him. Actually, you're not wrong. The large bird's voice had a hint of a smile. If you choose Jared, I will definitely refuse your request. As the large bird spoke, it pulled the little bird out again. The little bird was so anxious that it tried its best to jump out, but could not jump out. Solomon took out a small bottle from his bosom. It was half filled with a bright red liquid. Looks like you are already prepared. There's not much time left. I want to leave in peace. Solomon casually extended his crutch and pointed it at the little bird. With a burst of magic fluctuations, the little bird couldn't move and could only stare at Solomon with frightened eyes. There is not much time left. To be able to survive this year is a victory for me, Solomon said softly. Old friend, I'm going to start. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.